He threw her suitcase into the mud before she even reached the porch. Not a word. Not a warning. Wade Harlan, owner of half the land in Red Hollow, simply walked out of the saloon, looked at the woman who had just stepped off the stage, and knocked her luggage out of her hand with the end of his boot. The worn leather case split open when it hit the dirt. A white dress, the only decent one she owned, spilled out and soaked up the mud like it was thirsty for it. Evelyn Carter stood there and looked at what was left of the life she'd packed into that suitcase. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just looked up at Wade Harlan with eyes that didn't flinch, and that, more than anything, seemed to make him angrier. "Wrong town," he said. "Turn around." She didn't. And everything that happened in Red Hollow after that moment started right there, with a woman who refused to move and a man who had never been told no by anyone who had reason to fear him. If you've ever been written off before you even opened your mouth, if you've ever stood somewhere and felt the whole room decide who you were before you said a single word, then you already know what Evelyn Carter felt that afternoon. The question is, what would you have done next? Before we go any further, if this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Every week we bring you stories about people who refuse to stay where the world tried to put them. Don't miss a single one. And while you're at it, tap the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Red Hollow. The stagecoach had come in just past noon, and the dust hadn't settled from the wheels before the people on the main street of Red Hollow started noticing her. It wasn't that a woman arriving alone was unusual on the frontier. Women came through all the time, mail-order brides, widows following land claims, daughters trailing fathers who'd gotten gold fever and lost it somewhere in the hills. What stopped people wasn't that Evelyn Carter was alone. It was the way she moved, deliberate, unhurried. She stepped down from the stage like she'd measured the distance in her mind before her boot ever touched the ground. She was a big woman, not fat in the way that suggested laziness or excess, big in the way that some people are just built, like the frame underneath her was made from heavier material than most. Broad shoulders, thick hands that had seen work, a face that was plain and open and didn't apologize for either quality. She wore a traveling dress that had been brown once and was now the color of old dust, and her hair was pinned up in a way that said she'd done it herself in bad light with no mirror. Nobody came to meet her. She'd known nobody would. She reached up for her suitcase, and the driver handed it down with the kind of indifference that people in service jobs develop when they've seen too much, and she set it on the ground beside her and looked at the town. Red Hollow was not pretty. It was practical in the way that frontier towns were practical. Buildings put up fast and cheap, everything oriented toward function, nothing wasted on appearance. The main street was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, which told you something about what the people here cared about moving. There was a general store, a livery, a bank that looked newer than everything around it, 2 saloons, and a stretch of smaller buildings that housed things like a barber and a dressmaker, and a woman who reportedly told fortunes but mostly sold tinctures. Evelyn looked at all of it with the calm, measuring gaze of someone who was not easily impressed and had stopped being easily frightened some years back. That was when Wade Harlan came out of the first saloon. He was not a large man physically, but he carried himself like he expected space to open up in front of him, and in Red Hollow, it generally did. He owned the Harlan Ranch to the north, which was the largest operation in the territory. He had 5 full-time hands and a reputation for acquiring land in ways that other people found troubling but couldn't quite prove in court. He was wearing a clean shirt, which meant he'd been somewhere that required effort this morning, and he was in the kind of mood that clean shirts sometimes produce in men who'd rather be elsewhere. He looked at Evelyn Carter. She looked back at him. He walked over to her, and she thought maybe he was going to ask if she needed directions to wherever she was going, the way people sometimes did with strangers who looked uncertain. She was not uncertain, but she was prepared for the question. Instead, he kicked her suitcase. Not hard enough to send it flying. That would have required real effort, and he didn't think she was worth real effort. Just enough. A contemptuous little shove with the toe of his boot that toppled it sideways and popped the latch and let the contents sprawl into the mud that had collected in the gutter at the edge of the road. The dress went first. White cotton, trimmed at the collar. The kind of dress a woman packs when she's hoping things might go better than she expects. After that came a small bundle of letters tied with cord, a pair of work gloves, a book with a cracked spine, a tin that held what was left of her savings, and a framed photograph of two people she no longer spoke to but still carried because memory is stubborn that way. All of it, in the mud. Evelyn stood and looked at it. She was aware of the people on the street who had stopped to watch. She was aware of the two men who had followed Harlan out of the saloon and were standing behind him with their thumbs hooked in their belts. She was aware of the woman across the street who had pressed her hand over her mouth, not in horror, but in the particular way people do when they're watching something they find uncomfortable but can't look away from. She was aware of all of it. She was also aware that if she bent down to pick up her things right now, she would be establishing something about herself in this town that she would spend months trying to undo. "Wrong town," Wade Harlan said. "Turn yourself around." Evelyn looked at him. "I don't believe it is," she said. Her voice was even, not defiant, not shaking, just even, the way a plank of wood is level when it's been set right. Something shifted in Harlan's face. Not anger exactly, more like the surprise of a man who has said something he expected to end a conversation and found that it hadn't. "You got no claim here," he said. "I have the deed to the Calloway plot," she said, "filed 3 weeks ago in the county office." That changed things. She could tell by the way his expression went from dismissive to something harder and more calculating. He hadn't expected that. People who didn't belong somewhere rarely came with paperwork. He looked her over once more, the kind of look that was meant to make a person feel catalogued and found lacking. And then he turned and went back into the saloon without another word, his men trailing behind him. Evelyn waited until the door swung shut. Then she crouched down and began picking up her belongings, slowly and carefully, the way you do when you're making sure nothing else gets ruined. The tin had stayed closed. The letters were wet at the edges, but not destroyed. The dress was going to need a good scrubbing and might never be fully white again. She repacked the suitcase. She refastened the latch, which was bent now and didn't sit right. She stood up. The woman across the street had gone back inside. Most of the people who'd stopped to watch had found somewhere else to be. The dust the stage had kicked up was settling back onto the road. Evelyn Carter picked up her suitcase and walked toward the boarding house she'd read about in the letter from the land agent. Nobody offered to help her. She hadn't expected anyone would. The boarding house was run by a woman named Nora Fitch, who was 63 years old, had outlived 2 husbands and one of her own children, and had developed from that experience a personality that was equal parts practical and entirely unsentimental. She looked at Evelyn Carter on her doorstep, assessed the muddy hem and the bent suitcase latch, and the general air of a woman who had recently been through something and had not yet decided how she felt about it, and opened the door wider. $2 a week, Nora said. Breakfast at 6. Don't leave your things in the common area. That's fair, Evelyn said. People will talk, Nora added, which was not a warning so much as a statement of fact she felt Evelyn should have. They already are. I know, Evelyn said. Nora looked at her for another moment with the particular look of someone recalibrating an initial assessment. Rooms on the 2nd floor, last one on the left. The window sticks. I can fix that, Evelyn said. Nora nodded once, as though that was the answer she'd been waiting for, and went back to whatever she'd been doing before the knock at the door. The room was small and had a smell of cedar and old wool that Evelyn found honest rather than unpleasant. There was a bed with a quilt someone had made by hand. She could tell by the irregular squares, the places where the thread changed color mid-seam. There was a washstand and a mirror too small to see your whole face in, and a window that, as advertised, stuck. Evelyn set her suitcase on the floor and stood there for a moment in the middle of the room, which was what she always did when she arrived somewhere new. Just stood, took a breath. Let the space register. She had been doing this for 4 years, moving, finding the next thing. The farm in Missouri that hadn't survived the drought. The position as housekeeper in St. Louis that ended when the family moved east and didn't take her. The year in Kansas that she preferred not to think about in detail. Each time she had done this, stood in a new room and taken stock, she had tried to locate the feeling that told her she was finished moving. She had not found it yet. She wasn't sure she'd found it here either, but she'd found something. The Calloway plot. 40 acres of land outside town that nobody had touched in 11 years. Ever since old Marcus Calloway had died and left no heirs and no instructions, and a county dispute that took a decade to untangle. She had found the listing buried in a land agent's newsletter that someone had used to wrap a package sent to the rooming house in Kansas. She had read it twice. Then she had written a letter. She crossed to the window and wrestled it open. It gave with a grinding protest and let in a rush of dry afternoon air and the smell of horses and dust, and somewhere underneath that, something that was almost grass, 40 acres. Most of it hard-packed and forgotten, and almost certainly worse than it looked on paper. She would need to see it tomorrow. She came downstairs that evening for supper and found herself at a table with 3 other boarders, a young man named Pete, who worked at the telegraph office and had the nervous energy of someone who spent his days receiving other people's bad news, an older gentleman named Hatch, who was traveling through on his way to somewhere he declined to specify, and a woman about Evelyn's age named Clara Briggs, who worked at the dressmakers and had the particular quality of someone who notices everything and chooses to comment on very little. The conversation at supper was careful in the way frontier town conversation often is. Talk about weather and land prices and the reliability of the mail. Nothing personal, nothing sharp. Evelyn listened more than she spoke. She had always been better at listening. It was Clara who said it, quietly, as Nora was clearing the plates. "You're the one Wade Harlan went after this afternoon." Not a question, a clarification. "I am," Evelyn said. "He does that," Clara said. "Goes after people he decides are a problem before they've had a chance to be one." "Why does the town let him?" Clara looked at her with the expression of a woman who has asked herself this same question many times and arrived at an answer she doesn't like. "Because he hasn't given them enough reason not to yet, or because they're afraid of what enough reason looks like." Pete, across the table, had gotten very interested in the grain of the wood. Hatch cleared his throat. "Best not get in his way," is the practical advice. "I have the deed to the Calloway plot," Evelyn said. "It's already filed." Clara set down her cup. "The Calloway plot." "Yes." "That land is—" Clara stopped. Started again. "People say that land isn't worth working. People say a lot of things," Evelyn said. There was a brief silence. Clara looked at her with something that was not quite respect yet, but was adjacent to it, the way something can be the right shape before it's the right size. "You'll want to be careful," Clara said. "Harlan's been trying to get hold of that parcel for 3 years. Evelyn nodded once. She had suspected something like this. The price had been too low, and the county had been too slow. And the land agent who'd sent her the paperwork had sounded too relieved when she confirmed the transfer. "I'll be careful," she said, which was not the same as saying she'd be stopped. She slept poorly that first night, which was normal. New places produced light sleep, too many unfamiliar sounds, the body not yet knowing what to ignore. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, she heard voices in the street below. Low, male voices, the kind that don't want to carry. She lay still and listened and could not make out words but could make out intent, which was enough. She got up and looked out the stuck-open window and saw 2 men she recognized from the saloon that afternoon standing across the street, apparently in conversation, apparently not going anywhere in particular, apparently doing nothing specific. She watched them for a while. They didn't look up. She went back to bed. She lay there in the dark of the unfamiliar room with its cedar smell and its borrowed quilt, and thought about water tables and soil composition and the particular problem of land that had sat unused for 11 years and what that did to the ground. She thought about the dress in her suitcase, which she'd rinsed out in the washstand basin and draped over the chair to dry. She thought about what it would be like to wear it somewhere that wasn't in front of people who had already decided what she was. She thought about Wade Harlan's face when she'd said she had the deed, that shift behind his eyes. Not just anger, calculation. He was going to be a problem. She had known that from the first second his boot made contact with her suitcase. The question was what kind of problem, and what kind of problem she was going to be in return. So, she was up before Nora's 6 o'clock breakfast and out the door by first light. She borrowed a horse from the livery, a broad-backed gray named, according to the stable hand, Trouble, which she took as a sign that the universe had a limited imagination, and rode out on the road northwest of town until she found the marker that matched the numbers on her deed. She stopped. She looked. The Calloway plot was 40 acres of ground that the territory had essentially given up on. The fence posts that had once marked the boundary were rotted to stubs. Whatever had been planted here last had died and dried and been reclaimed by the pale scrubby grass that covered everything in this part of the country that wasn't actively being farmed. The old farmhouse, if it could still be called that, was a two-room structure with a sagging roof and a missing door, and a chimney that had separated from the wall on one side and was leaning away from the building with a slow, tired dignity. She got off the horse and walked the perimeter, slowly, looking at the ground the way a person does when they're trying to see not what's there now, but what's underneath and what might be possible. What she saw, most people wouldn't have understood. But Evelyn Carter had spent 20 years studying land, learning it the way some people learn languages, from the ground up, through long observation and a lot of mistakes. She'd studied it from books and from farmers and from the kind of people who are too old and too honest to bother with optimism. And what she saw on the Calloway plot was not a wasteland. What she saw was a particular kind of soil, dense, yes, crusted on top, but with a color underneath that spoke of mineral content that drought hadn't destroyed, only hidden. She saw the faint depression at the northwest corner that suggested the water table came closer to the surface there than anywhere else for a mile in any direction. She saw the angle of the land, almost imperceptible, but there, that would make irrigation possible without a pump if you built it right. She stood in the middle of her 40 acres in the early morning light and felt, for the first time in 4 years, something she could only describe as recognition. Like the land knew her too. She didn't let herself trust the feeling completely. She was not someone who trusted feelings over evidence, but she let herself have it for a moment, standing there in the wind with trouble pulling at the dead grass behind her. Then she got back on her horse and rode back to town. She had been back at the boarding house for 20 minutes, cleaning the dust off her boots at the back door, when she heard the laughter. She had heard laughter before. She had heard the particular quality that this laughter had, the kind that is directed rather than shared, the kind that has a target, and she knew without looking up that she was it. 3 women were standing at the edge of the alley beside the boarding house. She didn't know their names yet. She would learn them. 2 were younger than her, 1 was about her age, and all 3 had the look of women who had found a comfortable position in the local hierarchy and were protective of it in the way that people are when they've worked to get somewhere and are frightened of losing it. "That's her," one of the younger ones said, not lowering her voice. "The one who bought the Calloway plot." "Bought is generous," said the other. "Inherited the problem is more like it." "Did you see her come off the stage? I thought the step was going to—" Evelyn put down her boot and looked directly at them. They didn't stop talking. That was the worst kind she knew, the kind who wanted you to hear. She picked up her other boot, finished what she was doing, and went inside. She sat at the breakfast table with her coffee and thought, the land. Think about the land. Don't think about their faces. Don't think about the way that woman's voice went up at the end of what was supposed to be a joke. Think about the water table. Think about the soil. Think about what you know and what you need and what this is actually going to take. She pulled a small notebook from her pocket and began to write. She wrote for a long time. Nobody bothered her. Nora came through once, topped off her coffee without a word, and left. She was still writing when she heard footsteps stop at the doorway to the dining room, and she looked up, and there was a man she hadn't seen before, or hadn't noticed, which in this case turned out to be the same thing, though she would later realize she'd passed him twice without registering him. He was lean in the way that comes from work rather than intention, with a face that had been out in the weather long enough to look like it had earned its age rather than just accumulated it. He was holding his hat in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately place. Not the assessment she'd gotten from Wade Harlan, not the embarrassed avoidance she'd gotten from most of the rest of the town. Something quieter. Something that didn't seem to have decided yet what it thought. "You're the one who bought the Calloway plot," he said. "People keep saying it like it's surprising," she said. He considered that. "Suppose it is, to most of them. And to you?" He looked at her for another moment. "I saw you out there this morning, walking the boundary." She hadn't seen him. She filed that away. "And," she said, "you weren't looking at it the way people look at land they've made a mistake on," he said. "You were looking at it the way people look at something they're planning." She didn't say anything to that. He nodded once, as if she'd answered anyway, and went back through the doorway. She looked down at her notebook. Colton Hayes, she would find out his name was. The most respected cowboy in the territory, people said, though they said it in a way that suggested the respect had been earned through means that weren't entirely comfortable to think about. She did not decide anything about him in that moment. She was not the kind of person who decided things about people in moments. She went back to her notes. Outside, Red Hollow was waking up and deciding what it thought about her, and she was letting it think what it wanted, because she had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you could do to a person's assumptions was simply refuse to perform them. She had work to do. She turned to a fresh page and wrote at the top, "Water." Then she kept writing. The notebook had 12 pages filled by the end of that first week. Evelyn had mapped the Calloway plot by memory. Every depression, every patch of ground that held color differently, every place where the dead grass thinned enough to show what was underneath. She had walked it 3 more times, each time at a different hour, watching how the light changed what she could see. She had brought a long iron rod on the 4th visit and pushed it into the ground at intervals across the northwest corner, measuring resistance, feeling for the point where the soil changed character. She found what she was looking for at about 4 feet down. Not water itself, not yet, but the kind of ground that was holding something close, the way a sponge holds water even when you can't see it from the outside. She had not told anyone what she was looking for. She had not told anyone much of anything. That was by choice. In a town that had already decided who she was, talking about plans was like handing people ammunition before they'd bothered to aim at you. Better to let them think what they thought. Better to let them talk. And they talked. She heard it in pieces, in the general store when she went to price lumber, in the space between sentences at the boarding house supper table, in the way conversations would shift slightly when she walked into a room. The woman who bought the Calloway plot. The woman who thought she could farm land that wasn't farmable. The woman who, and here the tone would do something that wasn't quite laughter, but wasn't far from it either. She bought the lumber anyway. She bought it and hired a wagon from the livery and drove it out to the plot herself, because the man she'd asked to help decided he had other commitments he'd forgotten about until she mentioned who the land belonged to. That was on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, she had torn off the section of the old farmhouse roof that was beyond saving and had begun to understand what was actually wrong with the structure, which turned out to be less than she'd feared. The walls were sound. The chimney needed repointing. The floor on the east side had rotted through in 2 places, but the joists underneath were harder wood and had survived. She was on the roof, or what was left of it, when she heard the horse. She didn't come down. She kept working, pulling warped shingles loose and tossing them into a pile in the yard below, and waited. "You're going to fall," said a voice from below. She looked down. Colton Hayes was sitting on his horse at the edge of what had once been a yard, hat pushed back on his head, looking up at her with the same expression he'd had in the boarding house, that particular quality of watchfulness that wasn't quite neutral but hadn't committed to anything else yet. "I won't," she said. "How do you know?" "Because I'm being careful." He looked at the pile of shingles. He looked at the wagon with its load of new lumber. He looked at the farmhouse with its missing roof section and its propped open door. "You're doing this alone," he said. It wasn't a question. "At the moment," she said. "The man you asked at the livery," he said. "Harlan got to him." She stopped pulling shingles. "You know that for a fact?" "I know Wade Harlan," he said. "Doesn't need to be in the same room to make himself felt." She sat back on her heels and looked down at him. "Is that why you're here? To tell me who I'm dealing with?" "I know who you're dealing with," she said. "I knew the first day." "Then you know he's going to keep making it hard to hire help." "Yes." "And you're still up there?" "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he got off his horse and looped the reins over the fence post, the one that was still standing, and walked toward the house. "I have time this afternoon," he said. She looked at him. "I don't need charity." "I know that," he said, "and I'm not offering it. I'm offering labor, same as anybody. If it bothers you, pay me in coffee when you've got a stove that works." She considered him for a moment from her position on the roof. He was waiting without the particular restlessness that men get when they're trying to appear patient but aren't. He was actually patient. That was less common than it sounded. "There's a section of floor on the east side," she said. "Joists are fine. The boards need to come up and be replaced. The measurements are in the notebook on the wagon seat." He went and got the notebook. He read it without comment. He found the tools she'd stacked by the door and went inside. She went back to the roof. They worked until the light went, and he didn't talk much, which suited her, and when he did talk it was about the work, which also suited her. He was competent with his hands in the practical frontier way. Not trained, not precise, but experienced and adaptive, the kind of person who could figure out what was needed from what was available and not waste time complaining about the difference. When it was too dark to see properly, he came out of the house and looked up. She was already down, loading the discarded shingles onto the wagon. "Floor's solid," he said, "east side and west. You'll want to look at the window frame on the north wall. It's pulling away from the plaster." "I saw that," she said. He nodded. "You know what you're doing out here." "I know what I'm trying to do," she said, which was the honest version of the same sentence. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the fence post. "Harlan's going to do more than block your hired help." "I expect so." "You're not scared?" She looked at him. "I didn't say that." He looked back at her with that watchful, not quite committed expression, and she had the sense that she'd said something that adjusted his understanding of her, though she couldn't have said which direction. He got on his horse. "I'll be back Saturday," he said. "If that works?" "It works," she said. He rode back toward town. She finished loading the shingles, covered the open section of roof with a tarp she'd bought at the general store, and drove the wagon back to the livery in the dark. She didn't talk about Colton Hayes at the boarding house supper table, but Clara Briggs mentioned him anyway, in the careful way she mentioned everything that she had noticed and wanted to understand better. "I heard Colton Hayes was out at the Calloway plot this afternoon," Clara said, and the sentence had the shape of a question wearing a statement's clothes. "He helped with the floor," Evelyn said. "Colton doesn't generally help people," Clara said. "Not unkindly, factually. He said he had time." Pete, the telegraph boy, looked up from his plate with the expression of someone receiving a message that didn't quite decode. Hatch, the traveling man, had a particular stillness that meant he was listening harder than he appeared to be. "Harlan won't like it," Clara said. "Probably not," Evelyn said. "Colton and Harlan have a history," Clara said. She paused, arranging something in her mind. "They used to work together, years back, before Colton bought his own spread. It didn't end well." "What kind of history?" Clara looked at her with the expression of a woman choosing how much to give. The kind that makes two men very careful around each other in public, and not careful at all in private. Evelyn thought about the way Colton had said, "I know Wade Harlan," flat and without emphasis, the way you say something true that doesn't require decoration. She filed it away. "What's his spread?" she asked. "Small," Clara said. "About 20 acres west of here. Good cattle land, not good cropland. He does all right." All right, in frontier terms, could mean anything from bare survival to genuine comfort. Evelyn didn't press it. "Why does the town respect him?" she asked. Clara thought about that for a moment in a way that suggested the question deserved actual thought. "Because he doesn't lie," she said finally. "In a place where everybody's got something to hide, a man who doesn't pretend gets remembered." The next 2 weeks were the kind of work that doesn't look like progress from the outside. She fixed the chimney. She fixed the north window frame. She replaced the section of sagging roof, which took 3 days by herself and would have taken one with help. But the one person who'd agreed to assist didn't show up on the first day, and she stopped waiting for him after that. She dug a test trench at the northwest corner of the property, 8 feet long, 3 feet wide, progressively deeper, and confirmed what the iron rod had suggested. The water table was high here, higher than it had any reason to be given the surrounding landscape, and the reason was an underground channel that fed down from the hills to the north. That was the thing nobody knew about the Calloway plot. Or maybe Marcus Calloway had known it and had died before he could use it, or maybe the county dispute had buried the knowledge along with everything else. But it was there, a natural source of water running underground, close enough to the surface to tap if you knew what you were doing and patient enough to do it right. She sat at the edge of her trench in the afternoon heat and felt something she was careful not to call hope. She called it possibility, which was a word with less risk attached to it. She was still sitting there when she heard the horses, plural this time, and looked up to see 3 riders coming across her land from the south boundary, which was not where the road was. They weren't Colton. She knew that immediately. Colton rode like he was thinking about something else. These men rode like they were trying to take up more space than they occupied. She recognized 2 of them from the saloon. The third she didn't know. They pulled up at the edge of the trench and looked down into it, and then they looked at her, and the one she didn't know, the one in the middle who was broader than the others and had a face that had been rearranged at some point by something hard, smiled in the way that men smile when they want you to know the smile isn't friendly. "You're digging on Harlan land," he said. "I'm digging on my land," she said. She didn't stand up. She stayed at the edge of the trench with her hands resting on her knees. Standing up would have meant responding to his authority, and she didn't recognize his authority. "Harlan says different. The county deed office says different," she said, "filed 3 weeks ago. Recorded and witnessed." The man in the middle looked at the trench. He looked at the farmhouse with its repaired roof and its new boards visible through the open door. He looked at the pile of materials she'd stacked near the north fence. He took all of this in with the slow, deliberate inventory of a man who is cataloging what he intends to destroy. "Nice work you've done," he said. "Be a shame if something happened to it." She looked at him without flinching. "Is that a threat?" "Call it a friendly observation," he said. "Who are you?" she said. Something shifted in his expression. Men like this were not used to being asked to account for themselves by women sitting in dirt trenches. "Name's Rourke," he said. "I work for Harlan." "Then you can tell Harlan," she said, "that the deed is filed, the work is done, and I'm not going anywhere. And if anything happens to this property, I'll know exactly where to start asking questions." Rourke looked at her for a long moment. The two men on either side of him were quiet, in the way that muscle is quiet, waiting for direction. "You're a brave woman," Rourke said finally, and the way he said it stripped the word of everything good. "I'm a legal landowner," she said. "That's all that matters here." He held the look for another few seconds. Then he turned his horse and rode back the way they'd come, the other two falling in behind him, and she watched them cross her south boundary and disappear into the scrub. She sat very still for a moment after they were gone. Then she pulled her notebook out of her pocket and wrote down the date, the time, the names she knew, and a description of the man called Rourke. She wrote it carefully, in her clearest handwriting, because she had learned that the difference between a complaint that got taken seriously and one that didn't was usually the quality of the record. She put the notebook back in her pocket and went back to measuring the trench depth. She told Colton about it on Saturday when he came back. He listened without interrupting, which she had already come to understand was simply how he listened. Not a courtesy, just a practice. When she was done, he stood for a moment looking at the south boundary of her property. "Rourke," he said. "You know him?" "I know what he is," Colton said. "He's the part of Harlan's operation that doesn't have a name attached to it officially. He threatened the property." "He'll do more than threaten," Colton said. He said it without alarm, the way you say something you've known for a while. "Not right away. Harlan's patient when he thinks he can wait someone out." "I'm not going to be waited out," she said. "I know that," Colton said, "but he doesn't yet." She handed him the section of fence line she'd been trying to restring. He took it and started working it back into the post brackets without being asked. "You said you and Harlan have a history," she said. He glanced at her sideways. Clara had obviously not been the only one talking. "Some." "What kind?" He was quiet for a moment, working the wire. "The kind where I know exactly how he operates, and he knows I know it, and we leave each other alone because the alternative's worse for both of us." "Until now," she said. He looked at her directly then. "Until now," he agreed. She didn't ask him to explain what he meant by that. She understood what he meant by that. "I'm going to need water," she said, turning back to the project at hand. "I found the source, underground channel from the North Hills, but getting it up and distributed across the acreage is going to take infrastructure I can't build alone." "What kind of infrastructure?" She showed him the notebook. The diagrams she'd drawn, rough but accurate, based on a system she'd read about in an agricultural pamphlet published in Pennsylvania, and adapted in her mind to the particular geometry of this land. A series of shallow cisterns dug at intervals, connected by a network of channels that used the natural slope of the land to move water by gravity rather than by pump. It would take time. It would take hands. He studied the drawings for a long time. "Where'd you learn this?" he said. "Books," she said. "And a man in Kansas who farmed dry land for 30 years and wrote down everything that worked." "Have you done it before?" "No," she said. "But I understand the principle." He looked at her. "That's a different thing from doing it." "Yes," she said. "It is." He handed the notebook back to her. "I know 2 men who might be willing to work out here. They don't have any particular connection to Harlan. They're drifters, picking up jobs where they find them. I can't promise they'll stay if Harlan leans on them. I'll take what I can get, she said. The men Colton brought were named Dix and Aurelio. Dix was 40, maybe 45, a former trailhand who'd hurt his knee badly enough that long cattle drives were behind him and had been figuring out what that meant ever since. Aurelio was younger, maybe 30, Mexican-born, quiet in the particular way of a man who had learned that talking in English around strangers cost him more than silence did. He was the better worker of the two and had a specific knowledge of earth moving that he'd acquired doing irrigation work in New Mexico that Evelyn found immediately useful. She hired them at fair wages, better than fair actually, because she knew what Harlan could offer and she needed them to feel that leaving wasn't worth the savings. The four of them, Evelyn, Colton, Dix, and Aurelio, began digging the first cistern in the northwest corner of the property in the second week of October, when the temperature had dropped enough to make hard labor bearable. The town of Red Hollow watched this with the particular attention of a community that had already made up its mind but was now confused by evidence. It was the women who watched most carefully, Evelyn noticed. The men tended to look away or make jokes when they saw her in town, about the land, about the work, about the impracticality of a woman of her particular dimensions attempting to build something in the frontier dust. The jokes weren't clever, and she'd stopped hearing them individually, only as a kind of weather pattern, a hum of contempt that she'd learned to treat as background noise. But the women watched. Clara Briggs watched. Nora Fitch watched from the boarding house window when Evelyn came back each evening, filthy and exhausted, and didn't say a word. And the not saying a word had a quality that was different from indifference. Two women she didn't know came out to the property one afternoon under the pretext of looking for a lost dog. They stood at the edge of the work site for a while, watching Aurelio and Dix dig and Evelyn measure and calculate with a piece of chalk on a flat board she'd set up as a working surface. And the younger one said something to the older one that Evelyn couldn't hear, and then they left. There was no dog. She knew what that visit was. She'd seen it before in other places. The moment when a portion of a community's opinion was in the process of shifting, but hadn't shifted yet, and people came to look at the thing that was making them reconsider. She didn't read too much into it. She'd seen opinion shift back just as fast when something went wrong. And things went wrong. Not catastrophically, but in the grinding, daily way of difficult projects. The second cistern hit a shelf of rock at 5 feet down and had to be relocated 6 yards east, which changed the angle of the channel between them and required her to recalculate the grade. One of the channel walls collapsed after a rain that came in fast from the north and deposited 2 inches of water in 6 hours. Dix pulled his already bad knee stepping wrong in loose soil and was useless for 3 days. None of it stopped her. It made things slower and harder and occasionally made her sit on the ground with her face in her hands for a few minutes while she reorganized her thinking, but it didn't stop her. What almost stopped her was the morning she came out to find the first cistern partially filled with rock and rubble. Not collapsed. Filled. Deliberately. Someone had carried or carted a significant quantity of broken stone and dumped it into the excavation overnight, compacting it down in a way that would take days to clear. She stood at the edge of it and felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite despair, but was related to both. The thing that lives in the space between them. She stood there for a long time. Aurelio arrived first, before Dix, and stood beside her and looked into the cistern and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, in the careful English he used when he wanted to be very precise, "They want you to spend the time fixing it instead of building." "Yes," she said. "So we fix it fast," he said, "and we build faster." She looked at him. He was looking at the cistern with the expression of a man who had encountered sabotage before and had made a practical peace with its existence in the world. "Have you dealt with this kind of thing before?" she said. "In New Mexico," he said. "A landowner who didn't want us to finish a canal. We finished it anyway." She nodded. "We start clearing this morning," she said. "Both of us. I'll tell Dix to work on the channel grade so the day isn't wasted." They started clearing. It took 2 days, not the full week she'd initially feared. She reported it to the county sheriff, a man named Briggs, who was Clara's husband, and who received her account with the expression of someone performing the motions of official concern without any particular intention of following through. He wrote it down. He said he'd look into it. He said these things happened on frontier property, and it was hard to establish cause. She left his office with the paper copy of her report, because she'd asked for one, and he'd seemed surprised that she asked, which told her something about how often people left his office with documentation of what they'd said. She filed it in her notebook. She went back to work. It was Clara who told her about the meeting. Evelyn was at the general store pricing seed stock when Clara appeared at her elbow with the focused expression she got when she had something to say and had been working out how to say it. Harlan called a meeting, Clara said, for the landowners and ranchers, Thursday evening at the Alderman's Hall. Evelyn kept looking at the seed prices. About? About water rights, Clara said. He's bringing in someone from the county land office to talk about the drought projections for next year and what it means for water allocation. That sounds legitimate, Evelyn said. It is legitimate, Clara said. That's what makes it effective. He's also going to talk about the Calloway plot. She looked at Clara then. Why would he talk about my land at a landowners meeting? Because he's going to argue that the water channel running under your property is a shared regional resource, Clara said, and that any private development that diverts it for single-owner use would harm the surrounding properties. Evelyn felt the piece click into place with the clean, unpleasant sensation of understanding something she would have preferred not to. That's the play, she said. He's got 2 of the county men already, Clara said. I heard it from my husband, who doesn't know I'm telling you, so please… She stopped. I won't say where it came from, Evelyn said. Clara nodded. He's trying to get the water classified as a community resource before you finish tapping it. If he succeeds, you'll need county approval to develop it, and county approval costs money and time, and he controls enough of the county to slow it indefinitely, Evelyn said. Yes. She stood still for a moment, looking at a bin of winter wheat seed. She thought about the underground channel. She thought about the weeks of work already in the ground. She thought about Rourke on his horse at the edge of her trench, smiling at her. When is Thursday? She said. 4 days. I'll be there, she said. Clara looked at her. Harlan runs those meetings. I know, Evelyn said. I'm still coming. Clara studied her face for a moment with the expression she used when she was trying to determine whether someone was being brave or being reckless. Apparently she didn't fully resolve the question, because she just said, wear something that doesn't look like you've been digging, and walked back toward the dressmakers. Colton found her that evening, back at the property, working by lantern light on the grade calculations. You heard about Thursday, he said. Clara told me. He sat down on the fence rail, the one that was now properly fixed and would hold his weight, and was quiet for a moment. If you go in there and fight him openly, he'll use it against you, make you look unreasonable, make it about your character instead of the law. I know that, she said. You have to go in with something, he said, not anger, something he can't dismiss. I know that too, she said. He looked at her in the lantern light. Do you have something? She thought about the notebook. She thought about the 12 pages of observations, the diagrams, the trench measurements, the date and time entries going back to the first week. She thought about the Pennsylvania pamphlet she'd written away for and received 2 weeks ago, which contained a legal precedent from 1861 in which a landowner had successfully argued that a subsurface water channel feeding a private aquifer constituted private property, when documented and developed by the landowner prior to any competing claim. I have several things, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. You planned for this, he said. Not an accusation, recognition. I planned for something like it, she said. I didn't know exactly what shape it would take. How long? Since the first day, she said. Since he kicked my suitcase into the mud. A man who does that in the first 30 seconds is a man who doesn't stop. He was quiet. The question is, she said, whether the people at that meeting want someone to stand up to him, or whether they just want the meeting to be over. Both, Colton said. That's always both. Then I need to give them a reason to want the first thing more than the second. He looked at her. The lantern made the light uncertain, moving slightly in the night air, and his face was harder to read than usual, which with him was saying something. I'll be there Thursday, he said. You don't have to be, she said. I know I don't, he said. She looked back at her calculations. Then I'll see you Thursday. He got off the fence rail. He picked up his hat. He stood there for a moment in the way he sometimes did, like there was something else he was deciding whether to say. He didn't say it. He just walked back to his horse and rode back toward whatever the night had for him, and she worked for another hour by lantern light until the wind picked up and made the flame unreliable. She packed up her materials and walked to where she'd tied her own horse, the broad gray Trouble, who had turned out to be completely placid and had clearly been named by someone with a sense of humor or a very bad first impression. She rode back toward Red Hollow in the dark, thinking about Thursday, thinking about what she knew and what she could prove and what she needed to make them understand. The land was behind her now, in the darkness, with its fixed roof and its 2 cisterns and its network of channels still taking shape. She couldn't see it. She didn't need to. She carried the picture of it in her head as clearly as if it were daylight. Every measurement, every grade, every foot of repaired fence line. 40 acres that nobody wanted. She was going to make them sorry about that. Thursday came in cold, the kind of cold that arrived on the frontier without negotiation. One morning the air was merely sharp, and the next it had an edge that meant business, that meant the season had turned a corner it wasn't going to turn back from. Evelyn dressed in the dark of her boarding house room, by feel more than by the thin gray light coming through the window she'd fixed 2 weeks ago. She put on the white dress, the one that had gone into the mud the first day. She had scrubbed it 3 times, and it had come back mostly white. Not the white it had started as, but close enough. There was a faint shadow at the hem that would not come out, and she had decided, after looking at it for a long time, to leave it there. It seemed honest. She came downstairs and found Nora already in the kitchen, which was not unusual, but Nora was standing at the window looking out at the street rather than working, which was. "You're going tonight," Nora said. Not a question. "Yes," Evelyn said. Nora turned from the window. She had the expression she sometimes got, compressed, like she was holding something in place that wanted to move. "Harlan's got 4 of the county men," she said. "Not 2. I heard it from Alderman Pierce's wife this morning. 4. Evelyn absorbed this. That's more than Clara thought. "Clara didn't know about the Kendrick brothers," Nora said. "They came in yesterday. They own the water rights on the 2 properties north of yours, and Harlan's been feeding them the line about the underground channel threatening the regional table." She sat down at the table and thought about that. The Kendrick brothers were not men she knew, but she knew their land on the map she'd drawn in her notebook. 2 medium-sized operations north and northeast of the Calloway plot, good grazing land, water-dependent in the way all grazing land was. "Do they have a legitimate concern?" she said, because she was someone who asked that question even when she didn't want the answer to be yes. Nora looked at her. "Their wells haven't changed in 20 years. Harlan told them your cistern system would redirect subsurface flow and dry them up by spring." "That's not how the hydrology works," Evelyn said. "I know that," Nora said. "They don't." She was quiet for a moment. "Where did you learn about hydrology?" Nora's mouth did something that was not quite a smile. "My first husband was a surveyor. I spent 12 years going over his maps and asking questions he didn't always want to answer." She turned back to the window. "You need to be at that meeting early, not late. Early. So you're already in the room when Harlan tries to set the terms." Evelyn looked at the older woman. In all the weeks at the boarding house, Nora had offered her coffee and a room and the occasional factual observation. This was something different. "Thank you," Evelyn said. Nora picked up her dish towel. "Don't thank me. Win," she said, and went back to the kitchen. The Alderman's Hall was a building that tried to look more permanent than it was. Good lumber on the facade, everything behind it a little rougher, the way frontier institutions often presented themselves. It held about 60 people comfortably, and more than that when occasion required. By the time Evelyn arrived, 45 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to start, there were already 20 people inside and a fire going in the iron stove at the far end of the room. She took a seat at the end of the 3rd row, not at the back and not at the front, where the lantern light was good and she had a clear sight line to the speaker's position. She put her notebook on the seat beside her and the Pennsylvania pamphlet on top of it. She'd read the relevant section 4 more times in the last 2 days. She could have recited it. People came in and saw her and either nodded or didn't. She recognized some of them. The 2 women who had come to the property looking for a non-existent dog were there, sitting together 3 rows back. Clara's husband, the sheriff, came in with his deputy and took chairs along the side wall. The Kendrick brothers, she identified them by process of elimination, 2 men in their 50s who had the look of people who worked land seriously and were genuinely worried about what they'd been told, sat down in the front row. Harlan came in 15 minutes before the scheduled start, which told her he'd been hoping to arrive after her and had someone watching the door. He saw her immediately. She saw him see her. His expression didn't change, which meant he'd prepared for the possibility. He didn't come over to her. I went to the front of the room and spoke quietly with a man she didn't recognize. The county official, she assumed, a man in his 40s with the look of someone who spent most of his time behind a desk and found crowds slightly stressful. He had papers with him. So did Evelyn. Rourke was there. He had positioned himself near the back wall, standing rather than sitting, which was a choice that kept him mobile and gave him a view of the whole room. She noted it and looked away. Colton came in 5 minutes before the start and sat down in the row behind her. He didn't say anything. She didn't turn around. The meeting opened with the alderman, a heavy, careful man named Pierce, who had the political instinct of someone who had survived by making himself agreeable to whoever had the most power in the room and had learned to do it without visible embarrassment, calling everyone to attention and introducing the county official, whose name was Whitmore, as someone who had come to share important information about regional water conditions. Whitmore stood up and read from his papers. The drought projections for the following year were, as she had expected, genuinely bad. The territory had been in a deficit rainfall cycle for 3 years, and the models, such as they were, which was not very, but better than nothing, suggested a fourth. Several wells in the county had dropped 6 to 8 feet in the past 2 years. He had numbers. He cited them carefully. He was, she thought, an honest man doing an honest job, which made him more useful to Harlan than a dishonest one would have been, because honesty in the service of a prepared conclusion was more persuasive than fabrication. When Whitmore finished, Harlan stood up. He was good at this. She had to give him that. He didn't perform authority. He assumed it, which was a different and more effective thing. He thanked Whitmore. He spoke for a few minutes about the community's shared stake in regional water resources. He used words like stewardship and collective responsibility and long-term viability, which were the right words for this audience in this room with these concerns. Then he said, "We have a new situation on the Calloway plot." He paused to let that establish itself. A private operation has begun excavating cisterns and water channels on land that sits directly above the primary underground channel feeding the northern properties. He looked at the Kendrick brothers when he said this, not at Evelyn. Now, nobody's questioning anybody's right to develop their property. That's not what this is about. Another pause. This is about whether a single private development should be able to monopolize a shared regional resource without the community having any voice in it. He sat down. Several things happened at once. The Kendrick brothers shifted in their seats. Someone near the back made a sound of agreement. Pierce the alderman looked at his hands. Sheriff Briggs looked at the wall. Evelyn stood up. There was a particular silence that followed, not because people were waiting for her, but because her standing up was unexpected enough that the room needed a moment to process it. "I'd like to speak," she said, to Pierce rather than to Harlan, because Pierce was the nominal authority in the room, and she wanted to establish that she was working within the proper order of things. Pierce looked at Harlan. This was reflexive and probably unconscious, and told her everything she needed to know about how the room was organized. Then Pierce looked back at her. "The floor is open," he said, which was the right answer, even if it had taken a beat too long to arrive. She didn't stand at the front of the room. She stood where she was, in the third row, because going to the front would have looked like she was claiming territory. She hadn't earned yet, and because speaking from the middle of a room put you in the center of it rather than at the edge of it. "My name is Evelyn Carter," she said. "I hold the deed to the Calloway plot. It was filed and recorded 6 weeks ago. Before I address Mr. Harlan's concerns about the water channel, I want to address the gentleman in the front row." The Kendrick brothers looked at her. "Your wells have not changed in 20 years, she said. "I know that because I've spoken with people who know this land, and they won't change based on what I'm building. The underground channel feeding the northwest corner of my property is a lateral branch of the main regional table, not the main channel itself. My cistern system draws from the lateral. It does not intersect with the primary flow that feeds your wells." She opened the notebook to a page she had marked. "I have the survey measurements here, taken over 6 weeks, showing the depth and direction of the lateral channel and its relationship to the primary table. The measurements are available for anyone to examine." One of the Kendrick brothers, the older one, she thought, leaned slightly forward. The primary source of concern being raised tonight, she continued, is that a single private operation might monopolize a shared resource. I agree that would be a legitimate concern. It isn't what's happening on my property. What's happening on my property is a woman developing land that nobody touched for 11 years using a water source that nobody else identified or claimed. She paused. I'd ask Mr. Harlan, when did you become concerned about the water table on the Calloway plot? Harlan looked at her steadily. When the excavation started. Your concern began, she said, at the exact moment it became clear that the land was more valuable than anyone realized. She let that sit for a second. Not before. Not when the land was sitting unused. Not when it was deteriorating. At the moment someone developed it. There was a quality of silence in the room that was different from before. She put the Pennsylvania pamphlet on the seat beside her notebook and held up a specific page. There's a legal precedent from 1861, Harwick versus the County of Allegheny, in which the court established that subsurface water resources documented and developed by a private landowner, using investment of labor and capital, constitute a private property right when no prior claim exists. No prior claim existed on the Calloway lateral. I have 6 weeks of documentation establishing my development of it. She set the pamphlet down. If Mr. Harlan wants to make a claim on the water table, he's welcome to file one with the county office. The documentation I've generated will be part of the response. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of agreement, the quiet of recalibration. The particular sound a crowd makes when it has been presented with information it needs time to process. Then one of the Kendrick brothers, the older one, who had leaned forward, said, "Can we look at those measurements?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "Tonight, if you like." Harlan stood up again. His voice was controlled, but she had been watching his face during her 2 minutes on her feet, and she had seen the thing that happened there that he couldn't quite suppress. Not anger, exactly, but the specific expression of a man encountering an obstacle he'd underestimated. The legal precedent she's citing is from Pennsylvania, Harlan said. We're not in Pennsylvania. Territorial water law is different. I can address that, Evelyn said from her seat. Pierce started to say something about the order of speaking, and she nodded at him to acknowledge it. I'm sorry, Alderman. The Territorial Water Statute of 1873 follows the prior appropriation doctrine, which means the right belongs to whoever first puts the water to beneficial use. I filed my land deed 6 weeks ago and began beneficial development within 10 days of that. Mr. Harlan has not filed any water claim on the Calloway plot, ever. That's because the land wasn't worth filing on, Harlan said, and his voice had an edge now that he was working to keep out of it, and almost succeeding. Exactly, Evelyn said. The older Kendrick brother made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a cough, something in between. Harlan sat down. Pierce called the meeting back to a general discussion of regional drought preparedness, which was where it was supposed to have been all along, and the conversation moved into the broader territory of shared concerns and practical plans, and Evelyn listened and took notes and contributed once more on the topic of gravity-fed irrigation channels and what they had done in other drought-prone regions, and nobody tried to cut her off. When the meeting broke up an hour later, both Kendrick brothers came to her directly. The older one's name was George, and he was a man who showed everything he thought on his face, which she respected. He looked at her measurements for 8 minutes without speaking, following the lines she'd drawn, cross-referencing them against the survey markers she'd noted at the edges of the diagram. Lateral channel, he said finally. Yes, she said. Not the main table. No. He folded the notebook page she'd shown him carefully, as if he were going to give it back to her, and then appeared to realize she hadn't handed it over for him to hold, and handed it back. We've been worried about next year, he said. You should be worried about next year, she said. The projections are real, but I'm not the source of that problem. He nodded once, slowly. His brother, who had not said anything the whole time, looked at Evelyn and then at the pamphlet in her hand and then back at her. You came prepared, he said. I try to, she said. They left. Colton was behind her when she turned around, standing at a slightly careful distance, in the way of a man who had watched something go differently than expected and wasn't sure yet how much of that surprise to show. 4 county men, he said. I know, she said. Nora told me this morning. And you didn't change what you planned. I adjusted how I opened it, she said. I went to the Kendricks first because they were the lever. If Harlan loses them, he loses the meeting. Colton looked at her for a long moment. He's not going to let this go. No, she said. He's not. Tonight was a setback for him. Men like Harlan don't take setbacks quietly. She put the pamphlet back in the notebook and closed it. I know, she said. I've been thinking about what comes next since about the third week on the property. And I think he tries something before the ground freezes, she said, before the cisterns are operational, while there's still time to make the work look unfinished. His face did something she had come to read as concern, though on him it looked more like concentration. How much time do you have before the cisterns are operational? 3 weeks, she said. Maybe 4 if the weather turns hard. Then we move faster, he said. She looked at him. In the weeks of working alongside each other, she had become accustomed to the particular quality of his presence, the way he occupied space without demanding acknowledgement of it, the way he contributed without taking over. She had not become this one where he spoke in plurals without making anything of it. We, she said. I said what I said, he replied, and picked up his hat. The first serious frost came 5 days after the meeting, and the ground in the mornings had a skin of ice on it that took until mid-morning to thaw. They adjusted their schedule, earlier starts, working through the midday warm-up, stopping when the light went rather than pushing into cold dark. Aurelio had built irrigation channels in cold weather before and had opinions about what it did to the compaction of the channel walls that turned out to be correct, and saved them from a partial collapse on the East Channel that he predicted 2 days before it would have happened. She was beginning to trust the work the way she trusted her measurements, not as a certainty, but as a probability based on evidence. The cisterns were deep enough. The grade was right. She had tested the lateral channel with a hand pump borrowed from the hardware supplier and had brought up water. Not a lot, not a flood, but water, clear and cold, sitting in the bucket in her hands like a fact she'd spent 2 months proving. She held the bucket and didn't say anything for a moment. Dix whooped loudly from across the property because she'd sent him to dig the test hole and he was the one who'd hit water first. Aurelio came over, looked in the bucket, and nodded with the satisfaction of a man whose calculations have been confirmed. She set the bucket down carefully because she was not going to spill it, and wrote the time and the date and the depth at which they'd hit the lateral in her notebook. Colton arrived that afternoon, and she showed him the bucket, which was now sitting on the workbench inside the farmhouse, covered with a cloth to keep things out of it. He looked at the water. He looked at her. That's your proof, he said. One piece of it, she said. I want 3 test holes before I consider it confirmed. Of course you do, he said, not unkindly. She was almost smiling, which for her was something. The second and third holes will be faster now that we know the depth. He sat down on the repaired bench by the north window and turned his hat in his hands. It was a habit she'd noticed. When he was thinking, he did something with his hands, not nervously, but as if physical motion helped him process. Rourke was in town this morning, he said. She stopped what she was doing. Doing what? Having a conversation with the county records clerk, Colton said, which could mean anything. Or it could mean Harlan is looking for a paperwork angle, she said. That's what I thought, he said. I went in after Rourke left and spoke to the clerk myself. Off the record. He paused. Harlan had someone request a copy of your original deed filing and the survey markers from the county. He's looking for an error, she said. Something he can use to challenge the filing. That's my read. She sat down across from him. Is there an error? He looked at her steadily. Not that I know of. Is there? No, she said. I went over it 4 times before I sent it. I had a land agent in Kansas check my calculations before I filed. She paused. But that doesn't mean someone can't claim there is. He nodded. You have your copies. Everything, she said. Original filing, survey measurements, transfer receipt, land agent correspondence. She gestured at the locked box in the corner of the farmhouse, which she had brought out from the boarding house 2 weeks ago when she'd realized she was spending more time here than there. Everything I have that proves what I have. Keep them somewhere other than here, he said, if Rourke comes back. She hadn't thought about that specifically, which meant she wasn't thinking about everything, which she disliked. She looked at the box. Where? Nora, he said. Her house. The boarding house walls are solid, and she's not someone Harlan can lean on easily. He paused. She's the widow of the man who did the original survey on half the land in this territory. Harlan knows that. He's careful around her. That explained several things about Nora, including the hydrology. I'll take the box to her tonight, she said. Good, he said. They worked in silence for a while after that. She on the grade calculations for the third cistern, he repairing the section of north fence that had started leaning after the frost softened the post bases. It was the particular kind of silence that had developed between them over weeks of working in the same space. A silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but had a quality she found hard to name exactly. Not companionship, or not just that. Something more specific. She was thinking about how to name it when Dix put his head in the door. Men coming, he said. South Road. 4 of them. She was on her feet before he finished the sentence. She went to the south-facing window and looked. 4 riders, coming at a deliberate pace. Not rushing, but not wandering either. She recognized Rourke's horse before she could see Rourke's face. How far? Colton said, beside her. 3 minutes, Dix said. Colton looked at her. Stay inside until you know what this is. I'm not hiding in my own house, she said. I didn't say hide, he said. I said wait. There's a difference. Let them come to the door. Let them show what they're here for. She recognized the sense in it. All right, she said, but I'm at the door when they get here. Fine, he said, and went outside. She watched from the window as Colton walked out to meet them. Not urgently, not aggressively, just walking out to the middle of the yard in the way of a man who had every right to be there and wanted to be sure they knew it. He stopped and waited. Rourke pulled up 20 feet away. His 3 men spread slightly, which was a positioning habit that could be read as casual or as tactical, depending on what happened next. Hayes, Rourke said. Rourke, Colton said. Didn't know you had an interest out here. I help where I'm asked, Colton said. His voice was completely even. She could hear it clearly through the cracked window. Rourke looked past him at the farmhouse, at the construction materials, at the work site with its channels and its covered cisterns. His gaze had the quality she'd seen on him before, that slow inventory. We need to speak with the woman who owns this property, he said. She can hear you from here, Colton said. Evelyn opened the door and stepped out onto the repaired porch. She had her notebook in her hand, which was a choice, a deliberate signal that whatever happened here was going to be written down. Rourke looked at her. Miss Carter. Mr. Rourke. I'm here on behalf of Mr. Harlan, he said. He's made an offer for this property. Fair market value, as assessed by his man at the county office, plus 20%. All development costs reimbursed. She listened to the whole thing before she said anything. No, she said. Rourke didn't blink. Miss Carter, the offer is... I heard the offer, she said. No. The land isn't what you think it is, he said, and his voice had a particular quality on that sentence, something she couldn't quite name, too smooth to be honest. There are complications with the water rights that you may not be aware of. I'm aware of the water rights, she said. I've spent 6 weeks documenting them. The answer is no. Rourke looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Colton. He looked at the 2 of them standing in front of the farmhouse with the work site behind them, and she saw something move through his expression, not concession, but recalculation. Mr. Harlan will be disappointed, he said. Mr. Harlan will survive it, she said. One of the men behind Rourke shifted in his saddle. It was a small movement, but Colton tracked it without appearing to move his head. Things have a way of going wrong on frontier property, Rourke said, especially in winter. Structures fail, wells dry up, sometimes fires start from old stoves, he paused. It'd be a shame to lose all this work. She opened her notebook, wrote the date and the time and the sentence he'd just said, as close to verbatim as she could manage, and then looked up at him. I've written down what you just said, she said. Date, time, and your name attached to it. This document will be given to the county sheriff's office, the county land record office, and a copy kept separately from this property. She closed the notebook. I'd suggest that when you report back to Mr. Harlan, you include that information. Rourke looked at the notebook. Something shifted in his face, not fear, but a close relative of it, the expression of a man who operates in spaces where people don't write things down and has just encountered an exception. We'll be in touch, he said. Anyone comes asking, Nora said, they'll need to go through me. They might, Evelyn said. Nora closed the storeroom door. Let them try, she said. She said it the way she said most things, flatly, practically, without drama. But underneath it was something harder and older than drama, the particular determination of a woman who had outlived 2 husbands and a child and a territory's worth of men who had underestimated her, and who had decided somewhere along the line that enough was enough of that. Why are you helping me? Evelyn said. She hadn't asked it directly before. Nora looked at her with the expression of someone who finds the question both understandable and slightly irritating. Because you're right, she said, and because Wade Harlan has been doing this for 15 years and nobody has had the paperwork to stop him. She paused. And because you fixed the window. Evelyn laughed, which was not something she did often enough, and it surprised her when she did. It surprised Nora too, slightly, and Nora's mouth did the thing that was close to a smile. Get some sleep, Nora said. You've got work tomorrow. She did. She always did. And now the work had a clock on it, which she had known since the first day and had been building toward ever since, but which had become specific and urgent and real in a way that the abstract knowledge of it hadn't quite prepared her for. 3 weeks to operational cisterns. 3 weeks before the water she'd found and proven and developed would be working the way she'd drawn it in the notebook 10 pages in. 3 weeks, with Harlan on one side and Winter on the other, and a man named Rourke, who had come to her door and made what was technically a business offer in the same voice he would have used to make a threat, because he'd run out of ways to distinguish between them. She rode back to the boarding house in the dark and unsaddled Trouble herself, because the stable hand had gone home for the evening, and brushed him down in the lantern light, and gave him his grain, and he stood there eating with the sublime indifference of a horse who had no particular opinion about any of it, and she found that restful in a way she couldn't fully explain. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the window she'd fixed on the first week, and at the chair where the white dress was hanging, and at the tin on the windowsill that still held what was left of her savings. Smaller now than when she'd arrived, but not gone. She thought about Rourke's face when she'd opened the notebook. She thought about the water in the bucket. She thought about Colton standing in the yard with his hat pushed back and his voice going completely flat in the way it went when he was being as serious as he knew how to be. She thought about 3 weeks. She lay back and looked at the ceiling and waited for sleep to come, which it did eventually, moving in the slow way it moved when her mind was still solving problems even as her body went still. Outside, Red Hollow was quiet. Inside the storeroom at the bottom of Nora Fitch's house, behind a false-bottomed shelf, a locked box held every piece of paper that stood between Evelyn Carter and losing everything she had built. And on the Calloway plot, Dix was sitting by the iron stove in the repaired farmhouse with a blanket around his shoulders and a rifle across his knees, watching the dark through the windows, listening to the cold frontier night for anything that didn't belong there. Dix woke her at 4 a.m. Not in person. He sent Aurelio, who had come in early to beat the frost, and found Dix at the farmhouse door with his rifle still in his hands, and his face, the particular color of a man who has been sitting alone in the dark for too long, watching something he couldn't stop. Aurelio knocked on Evelyn's boarding house window with a pebble, the way she'd told him to if something happened at the property and he needed to reach her without waking the whole street. She was at the window in under a minute, and when she saw his face, she was dressed and downstairs in 4 more. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. She was already moving. "The East Channel," Aurelio said. "Someone came in the night, maybe 2-3 hours before I arrived. Dix heard them, but by the time he got outside, they were gone." He paused. "They put something in the channel." "What kind of something?" "Rubble again, and tar." He said the second word carefully, like he wanted to be sure she heard it clearly. "Poured over the upper intake section. It will set hard." She stopped walking for 1 step, just one. Then she kept moving. Tar was different from rock. Rock you could clear with muscle and time. Tar, set overnight in freezing temperatures, was a different project entirely. It bonded to the channel walls, to the compacted earth, to the stone lining she and Aurelio had spent 4 days placing. Clearing it without damaging the channel structure itself would take specialized tools she didn't have, and time she couldn't afford. She knew this. She processed it in the half-mile walk to the livery in the cold, pre-dawn dark, assembled it alongside everything else she knew. and by the time she'd saddled trouble and was riding out toward the property, she had moved past the first response, which was a cold, clean fury she allowed herself for about 90 seconds, and into the practical territory of what could actually be done. The East Channel was the secondary line. The primary flow ran through the West Channel to the main cistern. If the East Channel was blocked, she lost the distribution capacity for the lower third of the acreage. It didn't kill the system, it crippled one section of it. Which was the point, she thought, not destruction, delay, degradation. The slow accumulation of setbacks that would eventually wear her down or run her out of the money needed to keep repairing. Dix was sitting on the porch when she arrived. He looked exhausted and ashamed in equal measure. "I heard them," he said. "I went out the back. By the time I got around the east side, they were already gone." "You couldn't have stopped them alone," she said. "How many?" "2 horses," he said. "Maybe 2 men. Maybe 3. She nodded. She went to look at the channel. The tar had been poured into the upper intake section, about 8 feet of channel, where it narrowed before the first distribution point. In the gray early light, it looked like a wound that had clotted badly, everything sealed and wrong. She crouched and touched the edge of it, hard, not yet fully cured. TR needed heat to fully cure, and the temperature was barely above freezing, but hard enough that her thumbnail left no mark. Aurelio crouched beside her. "If we heat it," he said, "long and slow, careful." "Fire pots," she said, "the kind they use for road work." "The hardware supplier," he said. "He opens at 7, she said. She looked at the channel for another moment. "We need solvent as well, whatever he has." "I'll go when he opens," Aurelio said. She stood up. She looked at the farmhouse and the work site and the frost-covered land in the gray early light, and she felt the particular exhaustion of a fight that keeps requiring you to defend ground you've already won. It wasn't despair. She knew what despair felt like, and this wasn't it. It was something more like the awareness that the fight was going to be longer than she'd originally calculated, and she needed to account for that. She found Colton at the Alderman's Hall steps at 6:30, where she'd sent word to find him through Pete at the telegraph office, who turned out to be more useful than his nervous energy suggested when given a specific task. She told Colton what had happened. He listened without interrupting, standing on the steps with his coat collar up against the cold, his hat brim low. "Tar," he said when she finished. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not cheap, and it's not something you just have on hand." He paused. "Someone sourced it specifically for this." She hadn't thought that through yet, but recognized it immediately as true and important. "From where?" "There's a supply depot 2 towns east," he said. "Sells road materials to the county. Private buyers, too, if the purchase is big enough." He looked at her. "That's a record. A purchase like that leaves a record." She looked at him. "Can you get to that record?" "I know the man who runs it," he said. "Went to school with him 20 years ago. He's not a dishonest man." He paused. "He might be a careful one." "If Harlan's name is on that purchase," she said. "If Rourke's name is on it," he said, correcting her gently. "Harlan doesn't put his name on things like this. That's the system." He was quiet again. "But Rourke's name connected to a tar purchase within 2 weeks of the threat he made on your property. That's something." "That's something I can take to the sheriff," she said. Colton's expression didn't change exactly, but it shifted in the way it did when he disagreed with something and was deciding how directly to say so. "Briggs won't move on it alone," he said. "Harlan's got too much pull with the county." "I know," she said. "But if I have the purchase record, and I have what I wrote down when Rourke came to the property, date, time, his exact words." "You'd need to take it higher than Briggs," he said. "There's a territorial circuit judge," she said. "He comes through in January. That's 6 weeks out." "I know." She looked at him. "Can you go to the depot?" "I can go today," he said. "Then go today," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the early morning cold, and she recognized the look. It was the one he had when he was deciding whether to say the thing underneath the practical thing, and was usually choosing not to. This time, he said it. "You're going to win this," he said, "not because it's fair and not because it's easy, because you've been building the case since the first day and he doesn't know that." She held his gaze for a moment. "Don't tell me things like that," she said. "I can't afford to believe them yet." He almost smiled. "Fair enough," he said, and went to get his horse. The tar took 3 days to clear. Aurelio's firepots worked, slowly, carefully, in the way that frontier problem-solving worked when the solution required heat and patience and the willingness to ruin one pair of hands to save the work underneath them. Evelyn worked beside him for most of it, learning the technique as they went, which was not ideal but was the reality. By the end of the first day, her forearms were marked with small burns from the solvent and the heat, and she wrapped them at night and didn't mention them to anyone. On the second day, Clara Briggs appeared at the property. She didn't announce herself. She tied her horse at the fence post, the correct one, the one that held, and walked to where Evelyn and Aurelio were working the firepots and stood there for a moment watching. "The whole town knows," she said. Evelyn looked up. "About the tar?" "About the tar, and about Rourke, and about the meeting last week." Clara crossed her arms against the cold. "People are talking about it differently than they were talking before." "Differently how?" Clara was quiet for a moment, organizing the thought. "Before, people thought you were—" She paused. "Stubborn, impractical. A woman who'd bought a problem and hadn't figured that out yet." She looked at the channel, at the firepots, at the careful work of restoration. "Now they're saying Harlan's afraid of you." Evelyn sat back on her heels. "Are they wrong?" "No," Clara said, "but them saying it is different from them knowing it. When people think someone powerful is afraid of someone they've been laughing at, they stop laughing, and they start wondering which side they want to be on." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "Which side is your husband on?" Clara met her eyes. "My husband does what the county tells him, and the county tells him what Harlan wants. He's not a bad man. He's a careful one." She paused. "But he keeps his records correctly, which means your incident report is on file with a date on it that will be very interesting if anyone with authority ever asks to see it." "Someone might," Evelyn said. "I know," Clara said. She unfolded her arms. "What do you need?" Evelyn looked at her. "Right now I need 2 more pairs of hands on this channel. I can pay fair rate." Clara looked down at her own hands, the hands of a woman who worked at a dressmaker's and kept them accordingly. She looked at the firepots and the solvent and the ruined section of channel. "I don't know anything about irrigation," she said. "Aurelio will tell you what to do," Evelyn said. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she took off her good coat, folded it over the fence rail, and rolled up her sleeves. She was not a natural at it. Nobody was, their first day with firepots and solvent on frozen channel walls. But she worked steadily and without complaint, and by the end of the afternoon she had understood the basic technique well enough to maintain it unsupervised. She also, without being asked, went back to town at midday and came back with 2 men Evelyn didn't know, brothers named Foss and Emmett Crane, who were carpenters by trade and had no particular relationship with either Harlan or Evelyn, but had apparently decided, based on what Clara had told them, that they had time this afternoon. 4 pairs of hands instead of 2. The East Channel was clear by the following evening. Evelyn stood at the end of the restored section and felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not relief, but a kind of gratitude that was new in its quality. Not for the help itself, though she was grateful for that. For the fact of it. For what it meant that Clara had come, and the Crane brothers had come, and Aurelio was still here, and Dix was still sleeping on the farmhouse floor with his rifle. She had come to Red Hollow alone. She was not alone anymore, and she hadn't engineered it. It had accrued around her the way things accrue when you do the same right thing enough times in front of enough people who are quietly watching. She didn't say any of this out loud. She wrote in her notebook, recorded the restoration date and the current state of the channel, and went back to work. Colton returned from the depot 2 days after he'd left. He came to the property in the late afternoon and found her on the north fence line, working a section that had finally given way in a hard wind 3 nights before. He got off his horse and helped her with the wire without preamble, because that was how he operated. And when the section was finished and she'd straightened up and was rolling the extra wire back onto the spool, he said, "His name's not on the order." She looked at him. "Rourke's name," he said. "It's not on the tar purchase. It was bought under the name of a company, Harlan Consolidated Land Holdings, which is Harlan's legal entity for land acquisitions, which means the purchase is traceable to him, not to Rourke, but it goes through a layer of business organization that makes it harder to attribute directly," she said. "Yes. My friend at the depot is willing to provide a copy of the purchase record. He was—" Colton stopped. "He was troubled by it. He didn't know what it was for when they bought it. When I told him what was done with it, he was troubled. Troubled enough to put his name on an affidavit? Colton looked at her. I didn't know you were thinking about affidavits. I've been thinking about affidavits since the meeting, she said. The circuit judge comes through in January. If I'm going to file a complaint with the territorial court, I need the purchase record, my incident log, Rourke's threat documented, and at least one witness willing to attest to something on paper. He was quiet for a moment. You've been building this case. I've been building the land and the case at the same time, she said, because you can't win the land without the case, and you can't make the case without having built the land. He looked at her with the expression that had shifted over the weeks from watchful neutral to something she didn't quite have a word for, something that had weight in it and care, and the particular quality of a man who has revised his understanding of something several times and is surprised to find it still revising. My friend will provide the record, he said. Whether he signs an affidavit is a question I'll have to ask him separately. Ask him, she said, carefully, and tell him that everything that goes to the circuit judge is sealed until the hearing. His name won't be on the street before a judge sees it. Colton nodded slowly. You know how territorial court procedure works. I read, she said, which was again the honest version of a larger truth. He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. The Kendrick brothers, he said. George Kendrick came to find me yesterday. He wants to talk to you. She stopped rolling the wire. About what? He didn't say, but he didn't look like a man who had bad intentions. He looked like a man who had been thinking about something for 2 weeks and had arrived at a position. She thought about George Kendrick at the meeting, leaning forward over her measurements, following the lines, taking his time. Tell him I'm here in the mornings, she said, before 9. George Kendrick came on a Wednesday. He came alone, which she respected, and he came on time, which she appreciated, and he came with the same straight-backed seriousness he'd had at the meeting. A man who didn't traffic in small talk because he decided at some point in his life that his time and other people's were worth more than that. She gave him coffee, which was the closest thing the farmhouse had to hospitality at the moment, and they sat on the repaired bench by the north window, and he said, I looked at your measurements again. And? She said. And you're right, he said. The lateral channel and the primary table are separate systems. I can see it in the survey markers. He paused. I should have looked more carefully before I let Harlan put me in that meeting as a supporting argument. She waited. He told me my wells were at risk, George said. He was very specific about it. He described the subsurface hydrology in a way that sounded like he understood it. Another pause. He doesn't understand it. He understood that I don't understand it and used that. Yes, she said. He looked at his coffee. My brother and I have been dealing with Harlan for 8 years. Small things, mostly. He'd make a comment about a shared fence line. He'd let his cattle drift onto our grazing land in a way that was technically accidental. He'd recommend a buyer for our stock, and the buyer would offer below market, and we'd eventually find out the buyer had an arrangement with Harlan. He looked up at her. Nothing big enough to fight, nothing you could point at directly. Until now, she said. Until now, he brought us into a room and used our concern about water to make a case against your property, George said. And I sat in that room and let him do it. I was quiet for a moment. I'm not comfortable with that. She looked at him. He was not a man who made speeches, she could tell. This was costing him something, saying this much, sitting in her farmhouse and accounting for himself to a woman he barely knew. What are you asking me? She said, because she thought he needed someone to make it specific. I'm asking whether there's something I can do, he said, that would be useful, concretely. She thought about it for a moment. The circuit judge comes through in January, she said. I'm filing a complaint about the sabotage and about the threat Rourke made on my property. The complaint is stronger if there's testimony from people in this community who have experienced a pattern of behavior from Harlan, not just from me. George looked at her steadily. You're asking if I'd testify. I'm asking if you'd consider it, she said. The complaint is mine. The testimony would be yours. He was quiet for a long moment. She didn't fill the silence. She'd learned that some silences needed to be full before a person could find their answer in them. I'd need to talk to my brother, he said. Of course, she said. He stood up. He picked up his hat. He looked around the farmhouse, at the repaired walls, the new floor sections, The windows that sat true in their frames, the organized work surfaces with their tools and measurements, and the notebook that was always somewhere visible. "You did all this yourself," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Mostly," she said. "With help." He nodded once. "I'll be in touch," he said, and left. She watched him ride out across the south boundary and kept watching until he was gone. Then she opened her notebook and wrote down the date and what he'd said and what she'd asked. She was not going to count on him. She had learned not to count on people before they had done the thing they said they'd consider doing. But she let herself note it as a possibility, the way she noted the water in the bucket. Not a certainty, but a fact, with a date attached to it. The fire came 9 days later. Not the farmhouse. That was what she'd feared, what Rourke had implied. Not the farmhouse. The east fence line, the repaired section, in the early hours of a Thursday morning when the temperature had dropped hard and the wind was coming out of the northwest. Dix woke to it. The smell, which was different from the iron stove, different from cold air, specific in the way fire smell is specific and wrong at night. He was outside in under a minute and had the horse trough water on it in under 3, which was not enough water for a serious fire, but it was a fence line, not a building, and the ground was frozen hard enough that it didn't spread into the grass the way it might have in October. He sat with it until it was out. He sat with the smoldering fence posts and the scorched earth smell and the pre-dawn dark and did not go inside. In the morning, Evelyn stood at the fence line and looked at what was left. 12 feet of fence, 3 posts. The wire was intact. It didn't burn easily. But the posts were gone to ash at the bases and the section had collapsed. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned to Dix. "You got it out fast," she said. "Got lucky," he said. He had the look of a man who has not slept and knows it. "Wind died right before I smelled it. If it had kept up." "But it didn't," she said. He looked at the ruined fence line. "I can't watch the whole perimeter." "I know," she said. She went inside and wrote it down. Date, time, damage, Dix's account. And then she went to the locked box, which she'd brought back to the farmhouse 2 days ago because she needed to add documents to it, and the back and forth to Nora was taking time she didn't have. She looked at the lock. She thought about the fire. She took the box back to Nora that afternoon. Nora took it without comment and put it back under the false bottom shelf and closed the door. 3 incidents, Nora said. The cistern, the channel, now the fence. "Yes," Evelyn said. "It's escalating," Nora said. "Yes." Nora was quiet for a moment. "My husband surveyed this territory for 22 years, she said. He dealt with men like Harlan. He used to say they always escalate because escalation is what they have instead of a real claim. Evelyn looked at her. "What did he do about it?" "He documented everything," Nora said. "He kept records so complete that when it finally went to a judge, there was nothing to argue about. Just dates and facts." She paused. "He also made alliances, quietly, with people who had standing in the community." She looked at Evelyn. "You're doing both." "Trying to," Evelyn said. Nora nodded. "The Kendrick brothers were at my breakfast table this morning," she said. Evelyn looked at her sharply. "Both of them?" "Both of them." Nora's expression was unreadable in the way it was when she had decided something. "They asked if I thought you were trustworthy." "What did you tell them?" "I told them I thought you were the most thorough person I'd met in 30 years, Nora said, and that thoroughness was the only kind of trust that meant anything in a land dispute. She paused. "They asked if you'd reported the fence fire to the sheriff." "Not yet," Evelyn said. "I was going there today." "Go today," Nora said, "and don't go alone." She went with Colton because when she'd sent word to find him and told him what happened, he had come within the hour, and the set of his jaw on the ride into town told her he was angry in the contained, cold way that was more serious than hot anger, and rarer in men who had learned to distinguish between the two. Sheriff Briggs received them in his office with the expression of a man who has been waiting for something and is not glad it arrived. He wrote down the incident report. He asked the standard questions. He said he would investigate, which they both knew meant he would write the word investigate in his log and then find reasons why the trail had gone cold. But Colton said, before they left, "This is the 3rd incident, Amos," and he used the sheriff's first name in a way that changed the register of the conversation from official to personal. 3 incidents in 6 weeks, all on the same property, all consistent with the threat that was documented in the last report you filed. Briggs looked at Colton with the expression of a man being reminded of something he'd been trying not to think about. "The circuit judge is coming in January," Colton said. "That's 6 weeks out. These reports are going to be part of a territorial complaint. Everything you've written down is going to be examined." He paused. "I'm telling you that as a courtesy, so you know." Briggs was quiet for a moment. "I can increase patrols on the Northwest Road," he said. "That would be appreciated," Colton said. They left the office. Outside in the cold street, Evelyn said, "He won't do it." "He might do it a little," Colton said. "That's more than nothing." She accepted that. On the frontier, more than nothing was often the best available outcome, and you learned to work with it. They were walking back toward the livery when she heard her name from across the street. She turned. Both Kendrick brothers were there, on the sidewalk in front of the hardware supplier, looking at her. George raised his chin slightly in the way of a man who has made a decision. She crossed the street. George looked at her, and then at Colton, and then back at her. "We talked," he said. "My brother and I." "I know," she said. "We'll testify," George said, "about the meeting, about what Harlan told us and what we found when we checked it ourselves." He paused. "And about the cattle drift, and the stock buyer, 8 years of it. We'll put it on paper." She looked at him, then at his brother, who gave a short nod that confirmed it. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than she'd meant most things she'd said in Red Hollow. George Kendrick shook his head once. "Don't thank us yet," he said. "Thank us when the judge rules." "Fair," she said. He looked past her at the street, at the town he'd lived in for 20 years, and navigated carefully for most of it. "There'll be pushback," he said. "From Harlan." "Yes," she said. "You're not worried about that," he said, not accusing her, just reading her. "I'm worried about it," she said, "but it's coming whether I worry or not. So I try to put the worry somewhere useful." He almost smiled at that. His brother definitely smiled, briefly, and then reorganized his face. They left. Colton was standing behind her. She could feel him there without looking, the particular quality of his presence she'd grown accustomed to over months of standing next to him in hard weather, doing difficult work. "The Kendrick brothers," he said. "Yes," she said. "George Kendrick doesn't testify to things lightly," he said. "He hasn't put his name on a legal document in 8 years, as far as anyone knows." "I know," she said. "He did it fast," Colton said. "For him. He must have been thinking about it since the meeting. He strikes me as someone who was looking for the right moment to be on the right side," she said. "He just needed to see which side that was." She looked down the main street of Red Hollow, the street she'd walked off the stage onto 4 months ago with a busted suitcase and a mud-soaked dress and a room full of strangers deciding who she was. The street was the same. The buildings were the same. The cold was the same cold. Something was different. She couldn't have pointed to it on a map, but she felt it in the way she moved through the street and in the way the street received her. Not warmly, not entirely, not yet, but differently. The way a room feels different when the balance of it has shifted even before anyone has said what shifted. She had 3 weeks before the cisterns would be fully operational. She had an incident log that was now 3 entries deep. She had a purchase record coming from the depot. She had the Kendrick brothers. She had Nora's testimony if it came to it, and she thought it would come to it. She had Claire's husband's official reports with their dates and their details. She had the Pennsylvania pamphlet and the territorial statute and 40 acres of land with water running in it. And she had 6 weeks until January. She walked back to the livery to get Trouble, who received her arrival with his customary indifference, which she had come to genuinely appreciate. "We're going back to work," she told him, and he tossed his head in a way she'd decided to interpret as agreement. The final cistern came online on the 20th of November. She didn't mark it with ceremony. She opened the intake valve on the west channel, stood at the primary cistern, and watched water move through the system she had designed in her notebook and built with her own hands, and rebuilt twice after sabotage and kept building anyway. It moved slowly at first, filling the lower sections of the channels, finding its level, settling into the grade she'd calculated and recalculated and ultimately gotten right. Aurelio stood beside her. Dix was somewhere behind her. Colton had come out that morning. She hadn't told him it would be today, but he'd come anyway, as if he'd known, which she wouldn't ask him about because she wasn't ready for the conversation that would be adjacent to it. The water filled the primary cistern to the marker she'd painted on the interior wall. It held. The walls held. The channels held. The grade was correct to within a fraction of what she'd calculated. She stood there and watched it, and thought about the first test bucket of water sitting on the workbench in the early November cold, covered with a cloth. She thought about the notebook. She thought about the morning she'd arrived in Red Hollow and stood in the mud of the main street with her dress in the gutter and a man's boot print on her suitcase. She thought about all of it and let herself feel it for a moment without organizing it into the next problem. Then she closed the valve to let the cistern complete its initial fill at a controlled rate and turned to Aurelio and said, "The distribution channels need to be checked at the grade markers before we run a full flow test." "In the morning," he said, "the light's going." She looked at the sky. He was right. "In the morning," she said. She walked back toward the farmhouse. Colton fell into step beside her. "It works," he said. "It works at low volume," she said. "Full flow test tomorrow will tell us if the walls hold under pressure." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not going to let yourself be glad about this until the judge rules." She thought about that. "I'll be glad about it tonight," she said. "By myself. For about 10 minutes. He made a sound that was as close to a laugh as she'd heard from him. "That seems exactly right for you," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said. And the way he said it didn't have anything in it that sounded like a complaint. They reached the farmhouse door. She stopped and looked back at the land, at the darkening sky over the property, the network of channels she couldn't see but knew were there, the cistern she'd built from nothing on land nobody had wanted, in a town that had laughed at her, with water that nobody had known was there until she looked for it and found it and proved it and fought for it and was still fighting. 40 acres. 3 weeks to January. She went inside and lit the stove and sat down at the work table and opened her notebook to a fresh page, and in the quiet of the farmhouse with the water moving through her channels outside and the cold coming in around the windows she'd fixed herself, she began to write. The full flow test held. Evelyn ran it on the morning of the 21st, with Aurelio at the east distribution point and Dix at the west, both of them watching the channel walls for seepage or collapse while she opened the primary valve to full capacity. The water moved through the system with a sound she hadn't heard before on this land. A low, steady rush. Nothing dramatic, just water doing what water does when it's been given a proper path. The walls held. The grade was correct. The distribution reached every point on the diagram she'd drawn in her notebook 4 months ago in the cold of a boarding house room when this had all still been possibility rather than fact. She closed the valve. She checked the markers. She wrote down the numbers. "It works," Dick said from across the property, loudly enough that she could hear. "It works," she confirmed, at a volume that wasn't quite as loud but carried anyway. Aurelio looked at the channel with the expression of a craftsman examining finished work. Not pride exactly, more like the satisfaction of a man who knew what correct looked like and was confirming that this was it. "Full winter test will tell us more," he said. "Yes," she said. "But this is enough to file on." He looked at her. "The judge?" "January 15th, she said. 25 days. He nodded. He picked up his tools and went back to work, because that was Aurelio's response to most things. The acknowledgement, and then the continuation. She had come to find it one of the most honest qualities in a person. She went inside and wrote the test results in her notebook, and then opened the section where she'd been building the complaint document, a running account, organized chronologically, of everything that had happened on the property since October. The sabotage of the cistern, the tar in the East Channel, the fence fire, Rourke's visit and his words, written down as close to verbatim as memory allowed, with the date and time attached. The purchase record from the depot, which Colton had brought back in an envelope she'd immediately placed in the document box at Nora's house. The incident reports filed with Sheriff Briggs, each with their official date stamps. She read through all of it. It was 22 pages. She read it the way she imagined a judge would read it, looking for gaps, for places where the chain of evidence had a link missing, for assertions that depended on inference rather than documentation. There were 2 gaps she'd been aware of for weeks. The first was a direct connection between the Harlan consolidated purchase and the specific sabotage. She had the purchase record showing tar was bought, but nothing that put Harlan's men at her property on the night it was used. The second was Rourke himself. He had made the threat on her property, but he worked for Harlan in the informal capacity of a man whose name didn't appear on official payroll. She had been thinking about both gaps since November. On the first, the gap was narrow but real. What she had was proximity and time. The purchase came 8 days before the channel was sabotaged, and the implied threat from Rourke's visit documented. No judge would convict on it alone, but a judge building a picture of a pattern of behavior would find it consistent with everything else in the document. On the second, she had thought for a while that Rourke was simply a wall she couldn't get around. He worked for Harlan through layers of informal arrangement that were designed specifically to create distance. But something Nora had said in early December had stayed with her. He always escalates, because escalation is what they have instead of a real claim. And she had thought about that in the context of Rourke himself, and what escalation meant for a man who was the operational arm of someone else's schemes. The fire had been escalation. The tar had been escalation. And escalation, she had come to understand, was a pattern that left traces not just in what it did, but in what it cost. Someone had paid for the tar. Someone had paid for the time and the labor of the men who came in the night. Someone had arranged for the materials to be moved from one place to another without attracting attention. That was logistics. And logistics left records even when people tried not to leave them. She put the notebook down and went to find Colton. I was at his own spread when she rode out there for the first time. 20 acres west of town, as Clara had said. Good grazing land, well-maintained in the unsentimental way of a man who worked his property alone and had stopped apologizing for what he couldn't get to. The fences were solid, the outbuildings were practical. The house was small and had a porch that leaned slightly to the east that he obviously knew about and had decided was not worth fixing yet. He saw her coming and came out to meet her at the fence line, which she appreciated because it meant she didn't have to navigate the awkwardness of arriving at a man's house unannounced. "The test worked," she said. "I heard," he said. "Aurelio told Dix and Dix told Pete at the telegraph office, and Pete told everyone," she said. "The good news travels faster than the bad here," he said. "I think that's actually true, which is more than you can say for most places." She got off her horse and stood at the fence. "I need to ask you something about Rourke," she said. He waited. "He's not on Harlan's payroll officially," she said, "but he does work that requires payment. How does that work practically? Where does the money go?" Colton thought about this in the careful way he thought about things involving Harlan, like a man navigating a room in the dark where he knew the furniture was but was still being careful about his feet. "Cash," he said. "Usually. But cash in amounts large enough for extended employment has to come from somewhere. Harlan doesn't keep that kind of liquidity in hand." He paused. "He uses his bank account. The bank in Red Hollow is—" "His bank," she said. "The bank he has significant deposits in and a long relationship with the manager of," Colton said. "Yes, withdrawals," she said, "in the right amounts at the right times." He looked at her. "The bank manager won't give you those records." "He won't give them to me," she said, "but a territorial court order can compel him to produce them. If the judge thinks the complaint has enough merit to issue the order." Colton was quiet for a long moment. "You need the complaint to be strong enough to get the order, and you need the order to complete the complaint." "The complaint is strong enough without the bank records," she said. "The Kendrick testimony, the purchase record, the incident log, the documented threat. That's a pattern. A judge can rule on a pattern." She paused. "The bank records would close the second gap, connect Rourke directly to Harlan's resources in the weeks the sabotage occurred. And if the judge issues the order and the bank records confirm it, then it's not a property dispute," she said. "It's criminal interference with a land claim, which is a territorial offense, not a county matter, which takes it out of the jurisdiction of anyone Harlan controls locally." Colton looked at her across the fence line. The winter sun was low and cold, and his face was in shadow from the brim of his hat, but she could see his eyes. "You've been building toward this since October," he said. "Since the first week," she said, "when he kicked my suitcase. A man who does that to a stranger in the first 30 seconds is a man who has done it many times before and has never faced a consequence for it." He was quiet. "I didn't come here for a fight," she said. "I came here for the land, but the land came with him attached to it, and you can't separate them. So—" She stopped. "So this is what the land required." He looked at his hat brim for a moment. "You need someone who knows the bank manager," he said. "Do you know him?" "I went to school with half the men in this territory," he said. "Yes, I know him." He paused. "He's not a bad man." He's been in Harlan's orbit for a long time, and people in that orbit tend to mistake proximity for loyalty. But he has a family, and he has a sense of self-preservation, and if a territorial court order comes to his door, he'll comply. He won't have to do anything before the hearing, she said. The order comes after, if it comes. She looked at him. But if you could speak to him beforehand, not asking for records, just letting him know there's a hearing coming, Colton said, so he's not surprised by the order if it arrives. Yes. He looked at the fence between them for a moment. Not at her. At the fence? In the way he sometimes looked at objects when he was deciding something. Then he opened the gate. Come inside, he said. I'll make coffee, and we'll go through the complaint document. If you're presenting this to a circuit judge in 25 days, I want to know what's in it. She led her horse through the gate. It was the first time she had been inside his house, and it was exactly what she would have expected and slightly different in ways she didn't expect. The practical furniture, the tools hung in order on the wall, the absence of anything unnecessary. But there were books, more than she'd anticipated, a full shelf of them along the east wall, worn and read, and some of them read more than once by the look of the spines. She didn't comment on them. She sat down at the table and opened her notebook, and they went through the complaint document from the beginning, page by page. And he asked the questions a skeptical judge would ask, and she answered them, and when there was a gap, she said so, and they talked about how to address it. It took 3 hours. The coffee was strong, and he made it without asking how she took it, which turned out to be exactly how she took it, which she noted and set aside. When they finished, he sat back and was quiet for a moment. It's a good case, he said. It's a thorough case, she said. I don't know yet if it's good enough. Those aren't always the same thing, he said. No, she said, but thoroughness is the only part I can control. He looked at the notebook, then at her. Can I ask you something? Yes, she said. Why here? He said. There were other land claims, other plots. Why did you choose the one that was the hardest and the most contested and the most likely to go wrong? She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because it was real, she said after a moment. The other plots, the easy ones, the ones with better soil and better fencing and no history, they were real too, but they were the kind of real where you could tell yourself it was going to be fine. That land, she paused. I stood on it the first morning, and I could see what it was underneath what it looked like. And seeing things that other people haven't seen yet is the only skill I've ever been entirely sure I had. He was quiet. That probably sounds like I'm claiming something, she said. No, he said. It sounds like you're describing yourself accurately, which is rarer than it should be. She looked at him. I was looking back at her in the way he had, that way that had started as watchfulness and become something else over months, something that had weight and intention and was waiting for her to either acknowledge it or not. She was not quite ready to acknowledge it, but she was aware of it in the specific, deliberate way she was aware of things she intended to return to. I should get back, she said. Yes, he said. He walked her out to the fence. She mounted trouble. She looked at Colton standing at the gate of his property with his hand on the post and his hat pushed back in the low winter light. Thank you, she said, for the coffee and for the 3 hours. The 3 hours were useful to me too, he said. I wanted to know if the case was solid. And? It's solid, he said. Go win it. She rode back toward the Calloway plot in the fading afternoon, thinking about what solid meant and what winning meant, and what the difference was between having enough to make a case and having enough to change something. Whoa. January came in with a hard freeze that lasted 4 days and tested the cistern system in ways no artificial trial could have managed. The water in the primary cistern dropped 2 inches from ice formation at the surface intake and then stabilized, which was exactly what the design called for. The underground source maintained a temperature high enough to prevent deep freezing, and the surface ice was manageable and expected. She broke it each morning with a long-handled tool she'd made from a fence post and a flat piece of iron, and the water underneath was clear and cold and present. The freeze also, incidentally, closed the South Road for 2 of those 4 days, and delayed the arrival of the circuit judge by 48 hours. He came into Red Hollow on the 17th of January, a man named Aldous Crane, 61 years old, appointed by the territorial governor 8 years ago, and known, according to the information Colton had gathered, for 2 things: patience and an extreme intolerance for wasted time. She knew which of those qualities would work for her and which she needed to be careful of. The hearing was scheduled for the 19th. She had 2 days. She spent both of them in Nora's kitchen, going through the document one more time, not because she didn't know it, but because reviewing it kept her from the kind of anxious inaction that she had no use for. Nora provided coffee and occasional observations that were more useful than they looked. Clara came on the evening of the 18th and sat across the table from Evelyn and read the complaint document in its entirety, which nobody had done in full except Colton. When Clara finished, she set the pages down and said nothing for a moment. "My husband filed those reports correctly," she said finally. "He did," Evelyn said. "He's going to be uncomfortable with what this hearing does to his relationship with Harlan," Clara said. "I know. He'll be more uncomfortable if Harlan wins and knows that Amos's records were used against him." Clara was quiet. "Either way, he's in a difficult position." Evelyn looked at her. "I know that, Clara. I've known it for a while. I'm sorry for it." Clara shook her head. "Don't be sorry. He made the choices he made. Some of them were good ones." She paused. "I just wanted you to know I understand what this costs other people. That you understand it." "I do," Evelyn said. Clara looked at the document one more time. "It's thorough," she said, which, coming from Clara, was something. The hearing was held in the Alderman's Hall, the same room as the meeting in October, which she thought was either a coincidence or the universe working with limited imagination. Judge Crane sat at the table at the front of the room, which had been rearranged to resemble something like a formal proceeding. He was a small man with a large stillness, the kind of person who took up less space than you expected, but whose presence organized a room around it anyway. Harlan was there, with a lawyer he'd brought in from the county seat, a man named Prescott, who wore a suit that cost more than most people in Red Hollow made in a month, and carried himself with the particular confidence of someone whose competence was real, but whose ethics were negotiable. Rourke was at the back of the room. He had the watchful stillness of a man who did not expect to be called and was calculating what would happen if he was. Evelyn sat at the other side of the table with her document and her notebook and no lawyer, because the nearest lawyer she could have afforded would have cost her most of what she had left, and she had decided that the case was clear enough to present herself, and that presenting it herself was actually a choice, that a woman who had built an irrigation system from scratch on land nobody wanted could speak for that land in front of a territorial judge without needing a man in an expensive suit to translate for her. It was a risk. She knew it was a risk. Colton was in the third row. George and Thomas Kendrick were in the second. Judge Crane opened the hearing without ceremony. He had read her complaint, he said. He wanted to hear from both parties and from witnesses, and he would have questions. He expected concise answers and documentation to support any factual claim, and anyone who wasted his time would hear about it. Prescott made his opening. It was polished, and it was long, and it reframed everything. Evelyn was a recent arrival with a contested land claim attempting to develop a resource with regional implications. Harlan was a community stakeholder protecting shared interests. The incidents on the property were unproven, and the connections to his client speculative and unsupported. She listened to all of it and wrote 2 notes. One was a question she wanted to address. The other was a single word, speculative. When it was her turn, she stood up and said, "I'd like to present the documentation in chronological order, if the judge will permit." Crane looked at her over his glasses. "How long is the documentation?" 22 pages, she said. "I can summarize each section before presenting the primary source." He nodded once. "Proceed." She went through it, not reading. She knew it well enough to speak from it, checking the pages only for specific dates and quoted language. The deed filing, the development timeline, Rourke's visit and his words, read aloud from her notebook entry with the date attached. The incident log, the purchase record from the depot, each piece connected to the next by the chronology, each one supported by a document she held up and named. When she reached the Kendrick brothers, she said, "I have 2 witnesses who can speak to a pattern of behavior by the defendant that is directly relevant to this complaint." Prescott objected. Crane overruled him. George Kendrick stood up and testified in the flat, factual way of a man who had been thinking about how to say this for 2 months. He described the meeting. He described what Harlan had told him about the water table. He described what he had found when he examined the measurements himself. He described 8 years of small incidents, the cattle drift, the stock buyer, the fence line discussions, each one individually deniable, collectively a picture. Thomas Kendrick confirmed it all with a nod and 3 sentences. Prescott cross-examined George hard, pushing on the 8 years of small incidents, arguing that memory was unreliable and that patterns required more than circumstantial accumulation. George held his ground with the particular solidity of a man who had thought about this more than Prescott had given him credit for. Then Prescott made a mistake. He said, addressing Judge Crane, that the suggestion of criminal intent on the part of his client was unsupported by any direct evidence, that the purchase record was a commercial transaction with no proven connection to the property damage, that the threat documented by the complainant was hearsay from a single source, and that the incidents themselves could not be attributed to any specific party. Evelyn stood up before Prescott had fully finished. "Your Honor," she said, "I'd like to request that the court issue a compelled production order for bank records from the First Bank of Red Hollow for the period of October through December of last year. Specifically, withdrawal records consistent with cash payments during the periods when the documented incidents occurred." Crane looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man reassessing something. Prescott was already objecting. Relevance, privacy, fishing expedition. "The relevance," Evelyn said, still standing, "is that cash payments in amounts consistent with hiring men for night work, sourcing and transporting materials, and conducting ongoing property interference would close the connection that Mr. Prescott correctly identifies as currently inferred rather than proven. If the records show no such withdrawals, that is a fact in Mr. Harlan's favor. If they show withdrawals consistent with the timeline of the incidents," she stopped. "The court can draw its own conclusions." Crane looked at Harlan. Harlan's expression was controlled, but she had been watching his face for the entire hearing, and she saw what was there in the 2 seconds before the control reasserted itself. Not fear, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has been in rooms like this before and has never encountered an obstacle he couldn't see around and has just encountered one. "I'll issue the order," Crane said. Prescott started to say something. "The order stands," Crane said, in a tone that ended the sentence before it got anywhere. "Production within 48 hours." The room had a particular quality of silence. She sat back down. Colton, in the 3rd row, did not move or change expression, but she saw his hands resting on his knees, and they were still in a way that told her he was holding them still on purpose. The bank records came in 39 hours. She was at the property when Colton rode out with the news, which he'd gotten from Pete at the telegraph office, who had gotten it from the county clerk, who had been present when the bank manager delivered the documents to Judge Crane's temporary office at the Alderman's Hall. 14 withdrawals, Colton said, between October and December. 6 of them in the week preceding or following the 3 incidents documented in your complaint. She was standing at the edge of the primary cistern. She put her hand flat on the stone coping she and Aurelio had placed in November. Cold, solid. "How much?" she said. "Enough for 3 men and materials, the way he pays," Colton said, "based on what I know about how that operation runs." She took a breath of the cold January air. "What does Crane do with it?" she said. "He's already done something with it," Colton said. "He sent for the county sheriff this morning. Not Briggs, the county sheriff above Briggs, from the county seat." She looked at him. "That's not a property ruling." "No," Colton said. "That's a criminal referral." She stood very still for a moment. She had been building toward this for 3 months, and she had known it was possible, and she had constructed the case as carefully as she knew how, and it was still something different to hear that the structure had held all the way to the top of it. "Rourke?" she said. "Rourke left Red Hollow this morning," Colton said, "before the bank records were delivered." She thought about that. "He knew." "Someone told him," Colton said, "or he'd been watching for the bank manager to go to the hall and knew what it meant." He paused. "He's gone," which is itself information. "For the county sheriff," she said. "Yes," Colton said. She looked at the cistern, at the channels running across her property, at the farmhouse with its repaired roof and its solid walls and its window that sat true in its frame. "Harlan?" she said. "Still in town," Colton said. "Still with Prescott. Prescott's been at the hall all morning." He paused. "The word from the county clerk is that Crane is writing his ruling today." The ruling came the following afternoon. She was at the hall when Crane read it, along with most of Red Hollow, which had understood by now that something significant was happening, and had arranged itself in the available seats and along the walls and outside the windows in the cold. Crane read it without looking up from the document, in the flat, measured voice of a man who had composed the sentences carefully and intended them to be heard exactly as written. The land claim was confirmed. The deed and survey documentation were found to be valid and complete. The development of the subsurface water resource under prior appropriation doctrine was upheld. Any subsequent challenge to the water rights on the Calloway plot would be required to demonstrate a prior claim that did not exist in the county record. The incidents on the property, 3 documented instances of deliberate interference with a lawful land development, were referred to the county criminal court as malicious property interference under territorial statute. The bank withdrawal records and the purchase documentation from the supply depot were admitted as evidence in the referral. The identity of the individual who had made the threat on the property on October 31st was named in the referral by the description in the complainant's contemporaneous documentation. Wade Harlan sat at the front table and did not move while Crane read. She sat at the other side of the table and watched him not move, and she thought about the morning she'd arrived in Red Hollow with a suitcase full of everything she owned, and she thought about his boot and the sound the latch made when the case hit the mud, and the white dress soaking up the gutter water. She did not feel triumphant. She had expected to feel triumphant, and she did not. She felt something quieter and heavier. The particular feeling of a thing that has cost a great deal and has been resolved and must now be integrated into what comes next, because what comes next is the rest of it. The rest of her life, on 40 acres of land that could now begin to be what she'd seen it could be on that first morning in the October frost. Crane finished reading. He asked if there were questions. There were not. He left the hall. The room stayed quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of a crowd absorbing something. And then the sound of people started again, the movement of bodies and the low beginning of conversation. And Wade Harlan stood up and left without looking at anyone, and Prescott gathered his papers, and the room reorganized itself around the new fact of what had just happened. George Kendrick was beside her. He put out his hand and she shook it. "Well done," he said. "We did it together," she said. He shook his head. "We testified." "Testified. You built the case." He paused. "There's a difference." Thomas Kendrick shook her hand too, with the same brief nod she'd come to recognize as his version of a speech. Clara was near the door with her husband. Briggs looked pale and slightly relieved in the way of a man who has been walking a tightrope for a long time, and has just seen someone else remove the tightrope entirely without him falling. He didn't come over to her. Clara did. "The county criminal court will take 6 months, probably," Clara said. "Maybe more." "I know," Evelyn said, "but it's out of Red Hollow's hands now." Clara looked at her. "He'll lose," she said. "With what Crane referred, he'll lose." "Probably," Evelyn said, because she had learned not to say certainly about things that were probable but not yet done. Clara put her hand briefly on Evelyn's arm. A small gesture, not elaborate, which was exactly right, and went back to her husband. Nora was at the back of the room. She looked at Evelyn across the space between them with an expression that contained more than the distance should have been able to carry, and gave one short nod, and went home to her boarding house to make supper. Colton was waiting outside. Not on the steps, around the side of the building, out of the stream of people coming out. She found him there because she'd been looking for him, and she'd been looking for him because she'd come to understand over the course of 4 months that his presence was something she had stopped being able to account for as merely useful. He was leaning against the wall with his arms folded and his hat low, and he straightened when he saw her. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. They stood there for a moment in the cold, with the sound of Red Hollow around the corner of the building, the voices of people who had just watched something change. "What do you do now?" he said. She thought about it. "Spring planting," she said. "The water system is operational. The soil has had a winter to settle. I need seed stock and 2 more pair of hands for the season." She paused. "And the east fence line still needs that section replaced after the fire." He looked at her. "That's not what I meant." She knew it wasn't what he meant. "I know," she said. He waited. She looked at the corner of the building where Red Hollow continued its afternoon around the verdict that had just rearranged it. She thought about what she'd said in his kitchen. "Seeing things other people haven't seen yet is the only skill I've ever been entirely sure I had." She thought about him sitting across that table for 3 hours asking the questions a skeptical judge would ask. Not because he doubted her, but because he understood that she needed someone who would. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I know you're not leaving," he said. "And I'm not—" She stopped. "I'm not going to be someone who needs—" "I know that too," he said. He said it without impatience and without the edge of a man who is tired of having the same conversation. He said it like a fact he had understood for a long time and was simply confirming. She looked at him directly. "Then what are you asking?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not asking anything right now," he said. "I'm just standing here, in case that's useful." It was, she thought, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in Red Hollow. Maybe the most honest thing anyone had said to her in a long time. "It's useful," she said. He unfolded his arms. He put his hat on properly. He looked at the corner of the building. "Come on," he said. "I'll buy you coffee, real coffee, not boarding house coffee." "There's a difference?" "There's a dramatic difference," he said. "You've been drinking boarding house coffee for 4 months. You deserve to know what the other kind tastes like." She looked at him for a moment. Then she walked around the corner of the building with him into the street of Red Hollow. And the cold afternoon light was the same light it always was, and the buildings were the same buildings, and the dust of the main street was the same dust she'd stood in on a September afternoon with her suitcase in the mud. Nothing looked different. Everything was. In the years that followed, and there were many years, more than she had planned for when she first arrived, which told her something about the nature of plans, the Calloway plot became something she hadn't exactly envisioned in the beginning, which was also something she'd come to accept about things that grow. She had seen the water, she had seen the soil. She had not fully seen what water and soil and 4 seasons of careful work would produce on 40 acres that had been left alone for 11 years. By the second spring, she had enough working farmland to be selling to the general store. By the third, she had expanded into 2 additional plots, purchased legally, properly filed, with the documentation that was now her standard practice for any transaction that involved land in Red Hollow County. By the 5th year, the Kendrick brothers had approached her about a shared irrigation arrangement for their northern properties, drawing on the system she'd built as a model, which she agreed to for a fair and specific price, because she had learned that the difference between generosity and foolishness was usually a contract. The county criminal case against Wade Harlan resolved in the 2nd year. He did not go to prison. The territory was not organized enough in its criminal courts for that outcome, and Prescott was skilled enough to reduce the charges to civil penalties. But he paid them. He paid fines that cost him 2 of his smaller properties, including the parcel directly south of the Calloway plot, which he'd been sitting on as a buffer. That parcel was purchased at county auction by a man named Aurelio Vega, who had saved for it over 18 months and who built a house on it the following spring, and whose family eventually would live there for 3 generations. Rourke was found in a town 200 miles east and prosecuted on the property interference referral. He received a fine and was barred from the county for 5 years, which was not enough, in Evelyn's opinion, but was more than nothing, and she had learned to work with more than nothing. Harlan remained in Red Hollow. She had not expected him to leave because men like Harlan don't leave. They reduce, they contract, they find smaller terrain for the same instincts, and they wait for the conditions to change back, which they sometimes do and sometimes don't. He was still there in her 5th year, running a smaller operation on his remaining land, not coming near her property or her business, and she did not spend energy on him that she could spend on better things. She thought about him sometimes, though, not with anger. The anger had served its purpose, and she didn't carry it past its usefulness. But she thought about what it meant that someone like him had existed in this place for so long before she arrived. The years of small incidents the Kendrick brothers described, the way the meeting had been organized, the way the county men had been assembled, the ease with which he'd expected to wait her out. None of that happened in a vacuum. It happened in a community that had decided, in some collective wordless way, that the cost of opposing it was higher than the cost of enduring it. That community was different now, not transformed. She was not someone who believed in transformation, which implied something too complete and too fast, but different. Changed in the incremental way of things that change because enough individual people made enough individual choices that accumulated into a new pattern. Clara's husband resigned from the sheriff's position in the 3rd year and took a surveying job that paid better and didn't require him to be careful about whose office he was in. Clara opened a dressmaking business. It did well. She extended Evelyn a professional discount, which Evelyn accepted and paid for in kind with fresh eggs and occasional legal knowledge. Because she had continued to read and continued to learn, and at a certain point people started coming to her with questions about land claims and water rights, and she answered them because the knowledge was hers, and there was no reason to hoard it. George Kendrick died in the 4th year, from a heart that had been giving him trouble longer than he'd admitted to anyone. At his request, the funeral was small and practical. Thomas Kendrick came to her property the week after and stood at the edge of the cistern and said, he was glad he testified, and she said, "Tell me something I don't know." And he almost smiled in the way that was his version of laughing. Nora Fitch outlived several people who had seemed more likely to outlast her, which surprised none of them. She sold the boarding house in Evelyn's 3rd year to a young couple from the east and moved into a smaller house on the north side of Red Hollow, where she had a garden that she tended with a thoroughness that suggested she had opinions about soil that had never been fully expressed during her years of running other people's rooms. She and Evelyn had coffee together most weeks. They did not often talk about the past. They talked about the land and about the territory and about what was growing and what wasn't and why. And Nora's husband's surveys came up sometimes as reference material because the man had mapped this territory so completely that his work was still the most accurate available, and there was something in that continuity that both women recognized without needing to name. As for Colton, that is a simpler story and also a more complicated one, which is how it usually is with the things that matter. He was not a man who made declarations. She was not a woman who responded well to them. What they had arrived at, over the years, was something more like what they had always had, working alongside each other, speaking plainly, asking the questions that needed asking and leaving alone the ones that didn't. He still had his 20 acres, and she still had hers, and eventually the fence line between them became the only formal boundary that anyone paid attention to, because in practice the boundary was more theoretical than physical. He had been right about the coffee, which she had never told him, but which she thought about sometimes. There was one morning in the 4th year, early spring, the ground just thawing, the whole property smelling of wet earth and the particular promise that wet earth in spring makes to people who know what to do with it. When she stood at the edge of the primary cistern and looked at everything she could see from that point, and what she could see was enough to require some time to take in. The farmhouse with its solid walls and its windows that sat right. The channels running east and west across the property, visible now as permanent features of the landscape. The way made things become part of the landscape when they have been there long enough and are made correctly. The fence lines straight and whole. The fields, and she could call them fields now, which she had not been able to do in the 1st year, showing the early green of what was coming. She had 40 acres. She had water. She had 5 years of work in the ground. She had come here with a worn suitcase and a dream of starting over, and what she'd found was something she would not have predicted that first morning. Not a fresh start, which is a kind of forgetting, but a continuation of herself in a place that had tried to define her and had failed, because she had already defined herself in terms that had nothing to do with how she looked or where she'd come from, or what anyone in Red Hollow had decided about her in the first 30 seconds. She thought about that woman who'd stood in the mud. She didn't feel distant from her. She felt like that woman's logical continuation, the same person, with more evidence for what she'd always known about herself. The size of a person is not the measure of them. Everyone says this. Most people say it because it sounds right, because they have been told it sounds right, and have agreed without really examining it. But she had lived it in the specific and particular way that living something is different from agreeing with it, had felt what it meant to be reduced to a body in a room full of people who were looking at the body and not at the mind behind it, and had then spent 5 years demonstrating, without announcing, what the mind behind it was capable of. The frontier doesn't care what you look like. It cares what you can do with your hands and your knowledge and your willingness to get up after the 3rd setback and start again. This was not a comfortable truth. The frontier's indifference is brutal in its own way, and Evelyn had met people on this land who had worked as hard as she had and not found the water and not had the luck and not been left standing. She did not pretend otherwise. She did not mistake her own success for evidence that the world was fair because the world was not fair, and pretending it was would have meant pretending that the people who didn't succeed deserved not to, and she knew too much about what it actually took to believe that. What she believed, and this was the thing she had arrived at slowly, the way you arrive at things that are true rather than convenient, was that the world is not fair, and you build the best thing you can build anyway, and you document what happens, and you find the people who will stand beside you, and you keep going. That was not a comfortable message. It was not a simple one. It was the one the 40 acres had taught her, page by page, season by season, setback by setback, until she had it in her bones where it would stay. Colton came up behind her on that spring morning. She heard his step before she saw him, which was how it was now, and stood beside her at the edge of the cistern. He looked at what she was looking at. "Still checking the water level," he said. "Every morning," she said. "You know it's going to be there." "I know it was there yesterday," she said. "That's what I know." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a hard way to live." "It's an honest way," she said. He looked at the property, at the fields and the fence lines and the channels. Then he looked at her. "Worth it?" he said. She considered the question the way she considered things that deserved consideration, which was seriously and without rushing. "Ask me in another 5 years," she said. He almost smiled. "Fair enough," he said. And they stood there in the early spring morning on 40 acres of land that nobody had wanted, with the water moving through the channels below their feet and the whole long season ahead of them. And it was not a perfect moment, and it was not a resolved one, because life does not offer those. Not really, not in the way stories sometimes imply. But it was real. It was built. It was hers. And in Red Hollow, for years after, when people talked about the woman who came off the stage with a broken suitcase and turned the land, nobody wanted into something that changed how the whole county thought about water and soil and what a person was capable of. They told the story the way people tell stories that have settled into the local bone, which is to say they got some of the details wrong and the heart of it right. The heart of it was this: she saw something nobody else saw, and she refused to stop seeing it until everyone else could see it too. The rest was work.